Hi guys, and welcome to Boring History Story Relaxing. Tonight we step down into the cold earth as winter tightens its grip, your boots scraping frozen soil, while the wind scours the surface above you. Snow whispers across the ground, but down here the sound softens, as if the world is being wrapped in thick wool. You crouch, you duck, you breathe out a slow cloud that hangs longer than it should. This is the first night, and you can already tell your modern expectations did not make the journey with you. You probably won't survive this if you try to treat it like a cozy cabin getaway. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where you are in the world and what time it is for you right now. Now dim the lights and you let your body settle as the story begins without ceremony. You are standing at the edge of a hole that barely looks like shelter. It is more suggestion than structure, a dark mouth in the ground, reinforced with rough timber and patience. People around you do not hesitate. They move with the calm efficiency of those who have already accepted winter as an authority figure. You follow them down, bending low, feeling the temperature change immediately. The wind cannot reach you here. That alone feels like a small victory. As you step fully underground, the cold changed character. It no longer bites. It presses. The air is still heavy and surprisingly gentle compared to the chaos above. One mainstream historical reality often noted in settler diaries is that Earth, sheltered spaces, maintained a steadier temperature than surface cabins and sometimes hovering just above freezing, even when the surface plunged far lower. You feel that truth in your bones now. It is not warm, but it is survivable. In winter, survivable counts as luxury. Your eyes struggle at first. There is no sharp lantern glow, only a low, steady light that seems to sink into the walls instead of bouncing back. Soil absorbs brightness the way it absorbs sound. You notice the smell before anything else. Damp earth, wood smoke, wool, and something faintly organic that you cannot quite name. It is not unpleasant, it is honest. This is what shelter smells like when comfort is not the goal. You brush your fingers along the wall and feel the texture of packed dirt, rough but firm. Someone has smoothed it by hand, palm after palm, long before you arrived. A quirky detail passed down in letters and recollections mentions that people sometimes pressed coins buttons or small charms into the walls, not for decoration, but as a quiet way to mark time or ownership. You spot one now, barely visible, half swallowed by soil. It makes the space feel lived and claimed human. The ceiling is low. You instinctively hunch your shoulders even when there is no immediate danger of hitting your head. Your posture changes because it has to. This place does not allow sprawling thoughts or grand gestures. Everything here is smaller, slower, more intentional. You realize that sleeping underground is not just about avoiding cold, it's about accepting limits. As night settles fully, the sounds from above fade into a dull, distant presence. Wind becomes a rumor. Snowfall becomes a pressure rather than a noise. You hear the earth itself, a deep quiet that feels almost alive. Some scholars still debate whether this sensory isolation reduced stress for winter dwellers or heightened anxiety depending on individual temperament and cultural background. You cannot decide yet which side you are on. For now, the silence feels like relief. You lower yourself onto a prepared sleeping area. It is not a bed in any modern sense. Layers of dried grass, old blankets, maybe a hide or two arranged carefully to trap body heat. The ground beneath is cold but not hostile. It does not steal warmth so much as hold on to it reluctantly. You adjust shifting weight until your body finds a position that wastes the least energy. This is not about comfort, it is about efficiency. As you lie there, you become acutely aware of your breathing. Each inhale feels deliberate. Air moves slowly in enclosed spaces, and people here have learned to respect that. Ventilation holes are small and precious, carved with care so smoke can escape without inviting winter inside. There is a quiet understanding that too much fire is as dangerous as too little. You glance toward the dim glow and feel gratitude for restraint. Your thoughts drift as they always do at night, but they drift differently here. There is no scrolling, no clock glowing on a bedside table, no distant hum of electricity. Time loosens its grip. You do not know exactly when you will sleep, only that you eventually will. Fatigue works harder underground. It pulls you downward, insists you rest. Someone nearby shifts fabric, rustling softly. You're not alone, and that matters more than you expected. Shared warmth is not a metaphor here. It is a measurable resource. Bodies arranged close together retain heat better. This knowledge is passed down without lectures learned through cold nights and colder mornings. You feel yourself inch closer, not out of intimacy, but out of wisdom. As your eyes finally begin to close, you think about how strange this choice would seem to someone watching from above. Choosing dirt over open air, choosing darkness over windows. Yet here you are, breathing steadily, muscles relaxing inch by inch. The ground above you holds the storm at bay. The earth around you becomes both wall and blanket. You are not buried. You are sheltered. And as sleep approaches, you sense that this underground night is not an exception. It is a pattern repeated across harsh winters, across continents, across lives shaped by necessity. This first night teaches you something quietly important. Survival is not always loud or heroic. Sometimes it is simply knowing where to lie down when the world turns cold. You wake before you mean to, not because of light or sound, but because cold nudges you back toward awareness. It does not shock you awake. It reminds you that rest underground is always conditional. You shift slightly, careful not to disturb the others, and feel the packed earth beneath you hold steady. The night has passed without incident, which already feels like success. When you sit up, your breath fogs the dim space hanging low before slowly thinning. Morning does not announce itself down here. There is no sunrise to mark it. Instead, the day begins when bodies decide it must. Someone moves toward the ladder or the narrow steps carved into the soil wall. The work of winter does not wait for comfort. You follow them up, emerging just enough to feel the bite of air on your face. The difference is immediate and sharp. Above ground, the cold feels aggressive again, as if offended you ever left its reach. Snow crunches underfoot, hard and dry. This is why the digging mattered. This is why the earth was chosen. Before breakfast, before fire, tending. The ground must be worked again. You take up a crude shovel, its handle smoothed by many hands, and begin cutting into frozen soil nearby. Digging in winter is not graceful. Each strike meets resistance. The earth does not give easily when locked by frost. Yet people persist because expanding or reinforcing underground space now can mean the difference between safety and disaster later. A commonly accepted historical observation is that many frontier dugouts and earth shelters were not completed all at once. They evolved, slowly adjusted day by day as winter revealed weaknesses. You understand this now as your arms ache and your fingers stiffen. This shelter is not a finished object, it is a conversation with the season. You scrape away layers, sending small clods tumbling aside. The sound is dull, muted, absorbed almost immediately. Even the act of digging feels quieter underground, as if the earth prefers secrecy. You work in short bursts, pausing often, because energy must be rationed as carefully as food. Sweat is dangerous here. Damp clothing steals heat faster than wind. Someone nearby shows you how to angle the wall slightly inward, shaping it so weight presses down in earth instead of collapsing inward. It looks subtle, almost lazy, but it is deliberate. A fringe detail occasionally mentioned in regional accounts notes that some builders learned these angles by watching animal burrows rather than from formal instruction. You glance at the curve taking shape and think about foxes, badgers, creatures who have been solving this problem far longer than people. As the space grows, you notice how the shelter seems to change its mood. More room means more air, more movement, but also more surface for cold to creep in. Every improvement carries a trade-off. Historians still argue whether early underground builders prioritized warmth over stability, or whether both were equally weighted concerns that shifted by region and soil type. Standing here, shovel in hand, you suspect the answer was often simpler. They prioritized whatever failed last winter. Once enough work is done, you retreat back inside, bringing tools with you. Nothing stays outside unless it can be replaced easily. The interior greets you with its familiar smells, now mixed faintly with fresh soil. Someone tends the fire, carefully feeding it just enough to take the edge off the cold without thickening the air. You sit close, hands extended, letting warmth creep back into your fingers. Fire underground feels different. It does not dance or roar. It glows steady and restrained, like it understands the stakes. Smoke slips upward toward a narrow exit, its path memorized by long use. You watch it until your thoughts slow to match its pace. Food is simple and eaten without ceremony. There is no table, no proper seating. People squat lean balance bowls on knees. Every movement is economical. You realize how much unnecessary motion fills modern life and how quickly it falls away here. Even conversation is sparse, not from hostility, but from efficiency. After eating, you help rearrange bedding. Sleeping spots are adjusted daily, not out of fussiness, but because compressed layers lose insulation. Grass is fluffed, blankets are rotated, hides are checked for dampness. These tasks are quiet, almost meditative. You begin to understand that preparing to sleep underground starts hours before you lie down. As daylight fades above, though you cannot see it, the shelter subtly tightens. People draw closer together, gaps are checked. A piece of cloth is wedged into a drafty corner. Someone presses loose soil back into a thinning wall with practiced hands. The earth responds holding. You lie down again as night returns, feeling more aware than you were before. The space feels earned now. Your muscles hum with fatigue, the good kind that promises deep rest. You listen as the earth settles, tiny sounds of shifting weight, distant creaks muffled into near silence. Lying there, you think about how this labour changes sleep itself. Rest feels less like escape and more like participation. You are part of a system, one that includes soil, fire bodies and time. Nothing here is passive. As your breathing evens out, you notice something unexpected. The ground beneath you no longer feels foreign. It feels familiar, almost protective. Digging into it earlier has changed your relationship with it. You're not just hiding underground. You are shaping it, negotiating with it, trusting it to hold. Sleep comes faster tonight, heavier, pulled down by effort and quiet understanding. Above you, winter continues its work, but you are already learning how to meet it halfway, one careful shovel of earth at a time. You notice the difference at the moment you step back inside after another brief venture above ground. The wind had slapped at your face, pried at your clothing, demanded attention with every gust. Down here, the earth closes that argument almost immediately. The air stills. Your shoulders drop without asking permission. You had not realized how tense you were until the ground took that tension away. This is when it begins to make sense why people trusted soil more than walls of wood. Underground, there is no rattling, no whistling through cracks. The cold does not hunt for you. It settles contained, predictable. You lean your back against the packed wall and feel how solid it is, how indifferent to weather. The earth does not care how hard the storm tries. One widely recognized historical pattern is that settlers and rural families across the 19th century often turned to underground or earth-sheltered spaces during periods of fuel scarcity. Wood could be burned only once, soil insulated endlessly. You understand the logic now without needing it explained. The ground asks for effort up front, then pays it back slowly night after night. You stretch your legs out carefully, mindful of the limited space. Someone else shifts nearby, adjusting position with the same caution. Every movement here is negotiated silently. Privacy exists only in the sense that thoughts remain your own. Bodies are close, breaths overlap. Warmth is shared whether you planned on it or not. As the fire glows low, you pay attention to how warmth behaves underground. It does not rise and vanish the way it does in open rooms. It lingers. It pulls near the floor, settles into bedding, soaks into clothing. The walls seem to drink it in and release it back slowly. You imagine the earth as a massive battery charged by small flames and human presence. A lesser-known detail sometimes mentioned in personal letters is that people learn to read the walls themselves. A cool patch meant a thinning barrier. A damp spot meant trouble brewing. You run your palm along the surface again, feeling for changes. The wall feels uniformly cold but not wet. That feels reassuring. The ceiling draws your attention next. It presses down visually, creating a sense of enclosure that might feel oppressive to someone unprepared. Yet you notice something else. Without open space above, your thoughts narrow. Worries simplify. You are not thinking about next month or next year. You are thinking about staying warm tonight. That focus feels calming in its own way. There has long been discussion among historians about whether underground living reduced psychological stress or amplified it during long winters. Some argue the lack of light and space could weigh heavily on the mind. Others suggest that predictability and protection outweighed those concerns. Lying here now, you suspect the answer depended on expectation. You did not come here for comfort. You came here for safety. The quiet deepens as night settles fully. You hear no wind, no branches cracking, no distant howls. Instead, there is the soft rhythm of breathing, the faint pop of settling embers, the occasional shift of fabric. The world feels smaller, but also more manageable. You adjust your bedding again, tucking fabric tighter around your shoulders. The materials are uneven. Some areas are thick and insulating, others are thin and worn. You make mental notes without meaning to. This spot is warmer. That edge leaks cold. These observations become part of how you fall asleep, like counting breaths or listening to rain. Someone coughs softly. Another person reaches out without opening their eyes, placing a hand briefly on the shoulder. It is not dramatic. It is practical reassurance. Illness underground is a shared concern, and people learn to respond early quietly. You file that away, understanding that community here is not sentimental. It is functional. The fire dims further, fed only enough to survive the night. Excess heat would waste fuel and foul the air. This restraint feels almost ceremonial. Fire is treated like a guest who must be respected, not indulged. You watch the last glow fade into a steady ember and feel the temperature stabilize rather than drop. A quirky observation recorded in some rural accounts mentions that people sometimes slept better underground during storms because the absence of noise allowed deeper rest. You test that idea now as your eyelids grow heavy. Without wind screaming overhead, your body seems to believe it is safe enough to let go. You think briefly about those who choose to sleep above ground in cabins that creak and complain through winter nights. You imagine the constant vigilance, the need to tend fires aggressively, the fear of walls failing. Down here, vigilance feels different. It is slower, more patient. Your breathing deepens. The earth does not move, does not respond, does not demand. It simply exists, holding everything in place. The weight above you feels reassuring rather than threatening, like a heavy blanket tucked just right. As sleep pulls you under, you realize that safety is not always about distance from danger. Sometimes it is about choosing the right kind of closeness. Close to the ground, close to others, close to the limits of what you need. The underground shelter fades from something you occupy into something that holds you. And with that quiet shift, rest finally arrives unbroken and deep-wrapped in soil and shared warmth. You become aware of the smell before anything else shifts. It is subtle at first, almost easy to ignore, but once noticed, it cannot be unseen. Damp soil carries a mineral sharpness softened by smoke that has lingered long enough to lose its bite. Wool unwashed bodies, old wood and earth, blend into a scent that belongs only to places meant to be lived in, not shown. It clings to your clothing and hair, settling into fabric the way cold does. You realize this smell will follow you if you leave a quiet marker of where you have been. In the 19th century, many observers casually noted that people living in earth shelters carried a distinct odour that could not be scrubbed away easily, no matter how often they washed. Down here, that makes perfect sense. The walls breathe slowly and you breathe with them. You shift on your bedding and feel how warmth gathers differently tonight. It no longer feels like a thin layer hovering near your skin. It feels thicker, more stable, as if the space itself is participating. The earth around you has absorbed hours of shared heat and is giving some of it back. This is one of those understated truths often mentioned in agricultural manuals of the era rather than personal diaries. Soil works as thermal mass storing warmth when it can and releasing it gradually when needed. A faint drip sounds somewhere near the edge of the shelter. It is not alarming, not yet. Moisture underground is expected, tolerated, managed. You listen carefully, trying to locate it. The sound is slow, irregular, almost thoughtful. Someone nearby reaches up and presses a hand against the ceiling, checking for softness. The soil holds firm. There is a curious detail found in a handful of frontier accounts that mentions people sometimes preferred the earthy smell of dugouts to the sharper, smoky odour of poorly vented cabins. That preference surprises you until you realise how gentle this scent feels. It does not sting your nose. It does not coat your throat. It simply exists, constant and familiar. As night deepens, the shelter grows quieter but not silent. Breath moves around you. Fabric whispers softly when someone turns. A low murmur of voices fades as people settle, saving words for daylight when breath feels less precious. Underground speech costs heat. You lie back and notice how your body responds differently than it did the first night. Muscles relax sooner. Your jaw unclenches without effort. The smell, the warmth, the enclosure all signal the same message. You're contained. That message seems to matter more than comfort. There has been long-standing discussion among researchers about whether the sensory environment of underground dwellings encourage faster sleep onset. Some suggest the reduced stimulation helped the nervous system calm more quickly. Others argue it depended on familiarity rather than environment alone. From where you are lying, the answer feels personal rather than academic. Tonight, familiarity is doing most of the work. The fire has settled into a low glow again. Someone adds a single piece of fuel, no more. The flame flares briefly, then quiets. Smoke threads upward along a path it knows well. You watch it disappear into darkness, trusting the system that has kept people breathing through countless nights. Your nose is adjusted now. The scent no longer announces itself. It simply belongs. You inhale deeply and feel the air move slower, warmer, heavier than it did above ground. Breathing feels deliberate but not strained. Each breath carries the faint taste of soil and smoke, grounding you in a way you did not expect. Another small sound catches your attention. A quiet scratch, then stillness. A mouse perhaps, or something similar. The idea barely registers before fading. Underground life comes with neighbours who do not ask permission. People here have long accepted that complete separation from animals is unrealistic in winter. You tuck your bedding a little tighter and let the thought go. As sleep approaches, you realise the smell itself has become a part of your sense of safety. It tells you where you are. It tells you that wolves surround you. It tells you that fires burn long enough to leave its mark. Clean air might be a modern ideal, but here scent equals survival. Your breathing slows. The earth holds its temperature. The drip pauses. The space settles into a steady rhythm that feels almost intentional. Wrapped in soil smoke and shared warmth, you drift towards sleep again, guided not by silence, but by the quiet assurance of a shelter doing exactly what it was made to do. You wake with your neck stiff and your shoulders folded inward, not because something went wrong, but because the space demanded it. Low ceilings teach the body lessons faster than words ever could. You sit up carefully, instinctively ducking, even though you're already well below standing height. Pride is the first thing that learns to sleep underground, curled up and out of the way. The shelter feels smaller in the early hours, not physically but perceptually. Cold sharpens awareness. Every inch matters. You notice how the walls lean slightly inward, how the ceiling slopes just enough to guide condensation toward the edges, instead of letting it drip directly onto sleeping bodies. These details are not decorative. They are the result of trial error and nights that went badly enough to require change. Accounts from 19th century settlers often mention that dugouts and earth lodges forced people to abandon ideas of personal space they might otherwise have valued. Here that truth settles into you quietly. You cannot stretch fully, you cannot pace, you cannot stand and think. Thought happens crouched or lying down, shaped by the proximity to others. You roll your shoulders, slowly easing stiffness, and feel how the warmth trapped overnight has lingered, just enough to soften the cold. The earth has done its part again. While above ground, temperatures may have dropped dangerously low, underground conditions remain comparatively stable. This consistency was frequently cited in practical farming journals as one of the key reasons earth-sheltered spaces were favoured during severe winters. Someone nearby shifts and exhales slowly, still half asleep. Bodies move like this underground with care, avoiding sudden gestures. A quick movement wastes heat and startles others. Over time, people develop a shared rhythm and unspoken agreement about how to exist together without friction. You reach for your outer layer and pull it closer, tucking fabric beneath your chin. Clothing here is not about style or even fit. It is about layering in ways that allow adjustment without effort. Too warm and you sweat. Too cold and your body stiffens. Finding the balance becomes second nature quickly. There is an odd intimacy in how close everyone is. You know the sound of each person breathing. You recognize the rustle of specific blankets. You learn who turns often and who sleeps still as stone. These details lodge in your awareness without invitation. In underground living, anonymity dissolves. Some observers have remarked that low ceilings psychologically reinforced humility, forcing even the tallest individuals to bow. Whether intentional or incidental remains open to interpretation. What is clear is that hierarchy flattens in spaces where no one can stand tall. Authority looks different when everyone is crouched. As morning progresses, the shelter grows more active. Tools are shifted quietly. Bedding is rearranged again, lifted and shaken just enough to release trapped moisture. You help kneeling where you must, your movements compact and efficient. The ground beneath your knees feels firm, almost supportive, shaped by countless repetitions of the same tasks. A peculiar note appears in a handful of regional letters describing how children adapted faster than adults to these low spaces, turning limitations into games of crawling and hiding. You imagine that now, though, here the mood remains subdued. Winter does not leave much room for play. Still, adaptability feels like a skill learned early and reinforced daily. The fire is coaxed back to life gently. A single spark, a careful breath, a slow flame. Smoke curls upward and disappears as intended. Someone watches it closely until it behaves, then returns to their place. Fire underground demands attention, but not drama. You settle back down for a moment, not to sleep but to think. Your spine curves naturally now. The tension you felt earlier has faded into acceptance. This posture, once awkward, has become familiar. You realize how quickly the body learns when conditions insist. Researchers continue to discuss whether prolonged crouched living had long-term physical effects on people who relied on underground shelters season after season. Some suggest increased joint strain. Others argue that varied daily movement balanced it out. You flex your fingers and roll your neck gently, feeling neither damaged nor comfortable, just adapted. The air feels slightly warmer than when you first woke. Shared heat has begun to accumulate again. It does not take much. A few bodies are small firewalls that refuse to leak warmth easily. The system works when everyone respects it. Conversation remains minimal but not absent. A few quiet words pass between people, practical and direct. Plans for the day are discussed in low tones. No one raises their voice. Sound carries differently underground, and there is no need to challenge the space. You lean back against the wall and close your eyes briefly. The soil is cool but not cold. It feels steady, unchanging. Above you, winter continues its work, reshaping the surface world with wind and ice. Down here, the work is slower, quieter, focused inward. As you open your eyes again, you notice something subtle. The low ceiling no longer feels oppressive. It feels efficient. Everything unnecessary has been trimmed away. There is room to breathe, room to lie down, room to work. Nothing more. Sleeping underground teaches restraint not through instruction but through environment. The space does not allow excess. It does not accommodate ego. It holds only what is needed and asks you to do the same. As the shelter settles into its daytime rhythm, you find yourself oddly grateful for the limits it imposes. They shape your movements, your thoughts, your sleep. And in a winter that demands so much, those limits begin to feel like a kind of quiet mercy. As night gathers again, you feel how the space reorganizes itself without discussion. People drift closer, not dramatically, just enough to close the small gaps where cold likes to settle. You do the same, inching nearer to shared warmth until shoulders nearly touch. Underground distance is a luxury rarely afforded, and closeness becomes a quiet strategy rather than an emotional gesture. Heat behaves differently when bodies cluster. It does not radiate outward in neat circles. It accumulates, thickens, and lingers. You can feel it most clearly along your back and sides, where another person's presence turns the air from sharp to dull, from biting to merely cool. This is one of those plain realities often mentioned in winter survival accounts of the period. People slept together because it worked. You notice how breathing patterns begin to sync without effort. Someone exhales slowly. You follow without meaning to. Another person shifts, causing a brief ripple of movement, then stillness returns. The shelter settles again as if pleased by cooperation. The fire glows faintly, its contribution modest but meaningful. There is a soft pressure in knowing your warmth matters to others. If you pull away, the cold finds its way in. If you stay close, everyone benefits. This shared dependence reshapes behavior quickly. Individual preference yields to collective sense. Underground independence becomes negotiable. A small, often overlooked detail appears in several winter journals from the era. Families sometimes arrange sleeping positions, intentionally placing those who retained heat better near children or the elderly. You glance around now and see the logic in the layout. It is subtle, not announced, but thoughtful. Care is expressed through placement rather than words. You lie still and pay attention to how warmth shifts through the night. It rises and falls gently, influenced by breathing movement and the slow cooling of walls. You wake briefly at one point, not fully conscious, just aware enough to pull a blanket higher or press closer. No one speaks. Adjustments happen silently, instinctively. Some researchers have proposed that this constant low level of physical awareness kept sleepers in lighter stages of rest. Others suggest that familiarity with the environment allowed deeper sleep despite movement. As you drift back under, you suspect both can be true. Sleep here is layered, like the bedding beneath you never entirely separate from waking. A faint sound reaches you from above. Wind, perhaps, or shifting snow. It arrives muffled, stripped of urgency. The earth filters chaos into background noise. You barely register it before it fades. What remains is the steady presence of others, the reassurance of shared breath. There is comfort in knowing you are not responsible for holding the night alone. Fire is tended collectively. Walls are maintained by many hands. Warmth is pooled rather than hoarded. This arrangement feels ancient, older than the structures themselves. You imagine similar scenes playing out across frozen landscapes, across generations who learned the same lessons by trial. A curious anecdote appears in a few rural recollections, noting that people often slept better during the coldest nights because closeness eliminated the fear of waking alone and frozen. You consider that now as your body sinks further into rest. Fear takes energy. Here there is little room for it. You become aware of a child shifting nearby, a small sigh escaping as they settle deeper into warmth. An adult adjusts instinctively, creating a barrier against the cold edge of the shelter. This choreography happens without waking practice, through repetition rather than instruction. The air grows slightly heavier as night progresses, not unpleasant, just dense. Ventilation remains sufficient, carefully calibrated. Someone stirs and checks the fire, briefly adding nothing, removing nothing, simply confirming balance. You admire that restraint even as sleep tugs you downward again, your thoughts slow, drawn out like breath on a cold morning. You stop measuring time. You stop listening for morning. Instead, you exist inside the shared warmth, suspended between soil and sky, supported on all sides. When you finally sink fully into sleep, it is not because the night has ended, but because the system is working. Bodies, earth, and fire are aligned just enough. You are warm enough. You are close enough. That is all the shelter requires of you. You lower yourself carefully onto the bedding again, and this time you pay closer attention to what rests beneath you. It is not a single surface, but a collection of decisions layered one atop another. Dry grasses flattened into a mat, scraps of cloth stitched and restitched until the seams look more like scars than joins. A hide stiff in places, supple in others, shaped by long use rather than design. Nothing here is accidental. People learned quickly that the ground itself is never neutral. Without enough separation, cold creeps upward, patient and persistent. With too much padding, moisture gets trapped and becomes its own kind of enemy. The balance is learned through nights that go poorly and mornings that feel unforgiving. Records from rural settlements frequently note that bedding was considered as important as shelter itself during winter months. A poorly prepared sleeping surface could undo all the benefits of earth insulation. You understand this now as you shift, slightly redistributing weight, so no single spot bears the full chill of the ground. Comfort here is dynamic. It requires participation. You reach down and adjust a folded blanket, pulling it tighter beneath your hip. Someone nearby notices and mirrors the motion on their side. Bedding is often shared, traded, rearranged as needed. Ownership matters less than outcome. Everyone wants the same thing: to wake up able to move. There is an odd assortment of materials tucked into the layers. Straw, yes, but also dried leaves, old clothing, pressed flat, even paper in places. A few settlers wrote about stuffing newspapers into bedding, and nothing else was available. You smile faintly at the thought of headlines cushioning sleep words pressed into service as insulation. It feels resourceful in a way that borders on poetic. As you lie still, you notice how sound behaves differently close to the ground. Your ear catches the faint rustle of grass shifting beneath fabric, the subtle creak of hide responding to warmth. These are small noises, intimate ones. They anchor you to the moment, pulling attention inward rather than outward. You pull a covering higher around your shoulders and feel how uneven the warmth is. Some sections trap heat beautifully. Others leak it slowly, almost thoughtfully. Over time, people learned which materials worked best. Animal skins with fur left intact perform differently than woven cloth. Plant matter retained air, but collapsed under repeated use. These details appear scattered through period letters, usually mentioned in passing as if everyone already understood their importance. There has been ongoing discussion among historians about whether bedding choices varied significantly by region or were more influenced by individual circumstance. Soil type, available plants, access to animals, and cultural habits all played a role. From where you lie, the conclusion feels less academic. People used what they had, and they learned quickly what failed. Your body responds to the arrangement beneath you. Muscles loosen when pressure is spread evenly. Cold sharpens when it finds a gap. You adjust again instinctively, now tucking a corner here, flattening a ridge there. This quiet negotiation becomes part of the ritual of sleeping underground. It replaces bedtime routines you once knew. A faint smell rises as the bedding warms. Dry grass releases a dusty sweetness. Hide carries a deeper animal note. Fabric smells faintly of smoke and long use. Together they form a scent that signals rest more clearly than darkness ever could. You breathe it in and feel your eyelids grow heavier. Someone near you coughs once, then settles. Another person murmurs something unintelligible halfway between thought and dream. The shelter absorbs these sounds, softening them until they feel distant. You are aware of others, but not distracted by them. That balance feels important. An unusual detail surfaces in a few personal accounts describing how people occasionally rearranged bedding during the night rather than waiting for morning, responding immediately to cold spots instead of enduring them. You find yourself doing the same shifting a layer without fully waking. The body learns to protect itself quietly. You think briefly about how strange this would feel to someone expecting softness springs evenness. Here, unevenness is expected. It keeps you alert enough to adjust but relaxed enough to rest. Perfect comfort might actually be dangerous. It might encourage stillness long enough for cold to settle unnoticed. Some researchers have suggested that this constant low level of adjustment kept sleepers warmer overall by encouraging micro-movements that maintained circulation. Others believe it simply reflected necessity rather than strategy. Either way, you feel blood return to your fingers as you flex them beneath the blanket, satisfied that sensation remains. As the night deepens, the bedding beneath you warms further, shaped by your presence. It remembers where you lie. Tomorrow, it will need to be fluffed and reworked again. Nothing here is permanent. Everything responds to use. You let your head sink into a folded layer that passes for a pillow. It is lumpy, imperfect, but familiar now. Your neck finds an angle that works. Your breathing slows. The ground beneath the bedding remains cold, but it no longer feels threatening. Enough layers stand between you and it. Sleep approaches in waves rather than a single drop. You drift surface briefly, then sink again. Each time the bedding catches you holding heat just long enough to pull you deeper. The materials beneath you do not promise comfort. They promise survival. Tonight, that is more than enough. The fire underground never announces itself loudly. It does not crackle with confidence or throw sparks into open air. It waits. You notice it first by the way the chill eases near your knees, by the faint orange pulse that barely reaches the walls. Someone has tended it with care, adding fuel measured not by size but by consequence. You sit up slowly and watch the flame for a moment. It feels smaller than you remember, but steadier. Underground fires were kept deliberately modest, a practice noted repeatedly in winter manuals and homestead advice columns of the 19th century. Too much flame meant smoke thickening the air, stealing breath long before it offered comfort. Fire here is less a centerpiece and more a negotiated presence. You inch closer, palms open, feeling warmth seep back into stiff fingers. The heat does not rush. It arrives gradually, like it is testing whether it is welcome. Smoke slides upward in a thin ribbon, tracing a familiar path toward a narrow vent. Someone has shaped that channel carefully over time, smoothing it with hands and patience. It works because it has been respected. There is a peculiar intimacy to watching fire in a confined space. You cannot ignore it. You cannot let it rage unattended. Every change in flame color, every shift in smoke density matters. You learn to read it the way others read weather. A lazy flame means the air is calm. A struggling one suggests the vent needs clearing. An overlooked detail in some personal recollections mentions that people sometimes extinguished fires entirely during the coldest part of the night, relying instead on stored heat and shared warmth to avoid the risk of suffocation. You imagine that decision now, choosing darkness and cold over breathless warmth. It reframes your understanding of safety. You listen as someone stirs the embers gently, not feeding them, just rearranging what is already there. The movement releases a brief puff of smoke that curls upward obediently. The smell is familiar now, a mix of charred wood and damp earth. It settles into your clothes, your hair, marking you as someone who knows how to keep fire small. There has been considerable disagreement among scholars about how often underground fires were used continuously versus intermittently. Some argue they burned day and night. Others believe they were lit sparingly only when conditions demanded it. Sitting here, you suspect the truth changed with weather fuel supply and the temperament of whoever was awake to tend it. The firelight reshapes the shelter subtly. Shadows soften faces. Walls seem closer, then farther, depending on how the flame leans. The low ceiling catches light unevenly, creating a gentle flicker. that feels hypnotic rather than stimulating. Your thoughts slow to match it. You notice how people position themselves relative to the flame. No one sits directly in front of it. Angles matter. Heat radiates best when shared sideways, not hoarded. This arrangement appears intentional, though no one explains it. It is simply how things are done. A quiet memory surfaces from something you once read about how children were taught early to respect underground fire learning, not through lectures but through proximity. A careless movement could cost everyone comfort or safety. Watching the careful way the hands move, now you understand how that lesson sticks. As the night deepens, the fire grows quieter. Embers glow, then dim, then glow again as air shifts. You feel the temperature stabilize rather than rise. That steadiness feels reassuring. It means the shelter is doing its job, that no single element is dominating the others. You lie back down, positioning yourself so warmth reaches your core without overheating your face. The bedding beneath you holds on to heat generously, now aided by the fire's earlier work. The walls too seem to have absorbed enough to coast through the night. Some analysts have suggested that underground fires altered sleep patterns, encouraging shorter but deeper rest cycles. Others propose that vigilance kept people hovering between sleep and wakefulness. As your eyelids droop, you find yourself drifting into something that feels like both. You're resting but aware enough to sense shifts in air and sound. A faint crack echoes softly as a piece of wood settles. It does not startle you. Instead, it confirms presence. Fire is still there. Someone nearby adjusts a blanket and exhales slowly. The shelter responds with silence. You think briefly about how much trust this arrangement requires. Trust in walls that could collapse if neglected. Trust in fire that could betray you if mishandled. Trust in others to notice changes before they become problems. That trust does not feel reckless. It feels practiced. The flame dims further, leaving only embers. The light fades, but the warmth remains slow and dependable. Smoke thins to almost nothing. Breathing feels easy again, the balance has been struck. You close your eyes and let the remaining heat settle around you. Fire has done its part for the night. Now it waits, just like you, resting within limits that keep everyone alive. You do not hear the wind the way you expect to. Above ground, it would howl, scrape, shove itself against every loose surface. Down here it becomes something else entirely. A pressure, a distant suggestion. You lie still and listen, realizing that sound has been filtered through layers of soilwood and snow before reaching you. The earth acts like a thick curtain drawn between you and chaos. What remains are muted thumps, low groans, and the occasional deep sigh as the ground shifts under winter's weight. Snow settles overhead with a soft compression rather than a crash. You imagine it piling up, slowly insulating the shelter further with every inch. This muffled soundscape was frequently remarked upon in personal journals from people who wintered in earth-sheltered homes. They often described storms as feeling less threatening underground, even when conditions above were severe. Listening now, you understand why. Without sharp noise, danger feels distant. The storm becomes something to endure, not something that demands immediate action. You turn your head slightly and press an ear closer to the wall. The earth transmits vibration more than sound. You feel, rather than hear, the movement above. A dull tremor passes through the soil, likely caused by wind pushing against frozen ground or snow shifting its weight. It is subtle, but noticeable once you know to listen for it. There is a peculiar comfort in this kind of listening. You are aware of what is happening without being overwhelmed by it. The shelter does not isolate you completely. It translates the outside world into a quieter language, one you can tolerate even while half asleep. Some historical observers noted that people living underground developed an acute sensitivity to these vibrations, learning to distinguish between harmless weather and signs of structural trouble. A slow, steady pressure meant snow. A sharp crack or sudden change could mean collapse risk. You catalogue the sensations instinctively, filing them away without effort. You lie back and let your gaze drift upward, though there is little to see. The ceiling curves gently at surface, uneven but familiar. You imagine the layers above it. Packed soil, frozen ground, snow, sky. The distance between you and open air feels both vast and reassuring. A small sound reaches you barely audible. Footsteps, someone moving above, perhaps checking animals or supplies, despite the cold. The sound arrives soft and stripped of detail. You cannot tell who it is or how fast they are moving, only that life continues on the surface. There is an old anecdote from a Prairie family that described children learning to identify family members by the way their footsteps vibrated through the earth ceiling. You test that idea and are curious whether you could do the same. The steps fade before you can decide, leaving only quiet behind. As night deepens, the sounds grow fewer. Wind settles into a steady pattern. Snow stops falling, or perhaps you simply stop noticing it. The shelter feels heavier, as if the world above has tucked you in more firmly. You shift slightly, adjusting your position so your ear is no longer pressed against the wall. The shared warmth nearby feels steady. Breathing remains slow and even. The absence of sudden noise allows your muscles to unclench fully. Your body seems to trust the earth to alert you if something truly wrong occurs. There has been debate among historians about whether this reduced sensory input altered perception of time during long winters. Some suggest that nights felt longer without auditory cues. Others argue that sleep came more easily, shortening the subjective experience of darkness. Lying here, you feel time blur rather than stretch. Minutes lose definition. Hours melt together. You think briefly about how modern life rarely offers this kind of quiet. Even at night, there is always something humming, flashing, demanding attention. Here, quiet is not an absence. It is a presence. It wraps around you, thick and deliberate. Another vibration passes through the ground, gentler than before. Perhaps snow sliding from a roof above. Perhaps a tree shedding its burden nearby. You acknowledge it, then let it go. The shelter holds. A faint creak comes from the wooden supports embedded in the walls. They respond to pressure with slow, controlled sounds, never sharp enough to startle. These noises are part of the shelter's language, a way of communicating that it is still bearing weight as intended. You notice that your breathing has slowed further. Your chest rises and falls in time with nothing external. The world has narrowed to sensation, warmth, pressure, stillness. Sound reduced to vibration. A stray thought drifts through your mind. If something were to happen above, would you know? The question feels less anxious than curious. The answer seems to be yes, in the way people have always known. Through change, through disruption, through the earth speaking louder. That reassurance settles you deeper into rest. You're not blind or deaf down here. You're simply shielded. The difference matters. As sleep pulls you closer, the sounds fade further, not because they stop, but because your attention loosens its grip. The earth continues to translate the outside world, but you no longer feel the need to listen actively. Wrapped in soil and silence, you drift into a sleep shaped by weight rather than noise. The storm above becomes part of the ground's burden, not yours to carry, and for now that is enough. You wake to a soft, persistent sound that takes a moment to place. It's not wind, it is not breath. It is slower, more deliberate. A drip. Somewhere above you moisture has gathered enough confidence to let go. At first it feels distant, almost polite. Then another follows, landing with a muted tap against packed soil near the edge of the shelter. Condensation is the quiet companion of underground sleep, never dramatic, never entirely absent. You lie still and listen, gauging rhythm distance, intent. People in the 19th century learned early that moisture was not just an inconvenience below ground. It was a problem that demanded attention before it escalated. Too much dampness invited rot mold and sickness. Too little awareness let small leaks become structural threats. This balance was part of daily vigilance, as important as tending fire or rationing food. You sit up slowly, careful not to bump the ceiling, and trace the sound with your eyes. A darker patch spreads faintly across the earth. Overhead, glistening in the fire's weak glow. Someone else notices at the same time. No words are exchanged. A shallow bowl is slid into place beneath the drip, catching it before it reaches bedding. The solution is simple but temporary. Everyone understands that. Moisture underground is not something you defeat. It is something you manage, redirect, negotiate with. The earth breathes, and sometimes that breath condenses. A curious note appears in several settler letters describing how families learn to predict condensation by changes in temperature or the behavior of smoke. If smoke lingered too long or clung low, dampness often followed. You think back to the fire earlier, to how carefully it was restrained. The connection feels clearer now. You run your fingers along the wall near your sleeping area, checking for softness. The soil remains firm. That is a relief. Dampness without collapse is tolerable. Collapse is not. You wipe your hand on your clothing and settle back down, satisfied for now. The dripping slows as the bowl fills. Someone empties it quietly near the wall where water can be absorbed without pooling. This routine repeats often enough that it feels practiced rather than improvised. You realize that underground sleep includes an entire vocabulary of maintenance, much of it learned through repetition rather than instruction. There has been disagreement among researchers about how often condensation forced people to abandon underground shelters during winter. Some argued it was a constant threat. Others suggest experienced builders mitigated it successfully most of the time. From your position, the truth seems situational. Soil type, snowfall, internal heat and ventilation all play a role. No single answer fits every shelter. The air feels slightly heavier now, carrying a cool dampness that settles against your skin. You adjust your bedding instinctively, pulling layers higher to protect against chill rather than moisture. Wet cold feels sharper, more insistent. Dry cold can be tolerated. You learn that distinction quickly. A small but telling detail surfaces from historical accounts mentioning that people often rotated sleeping positions to avoid damp spots, even if it meant sacrificing warmth temporarily. You consider doing the same, shifting a few inches toward a drier section. The ground beneath you feels marginally warmer there, a sign that heat has been held longer. As you lie awake, the sound of dripping fades again, or perhaps the temperature has stabilized. Perhaps the bowl has done its job. Either way, the shelter quiets, and with it your thoughts slow. The ceiling above seems closer when dampness is involved. Not physically, but psychologically. Water reminds you that gravity is always present, that the earth you trust can change its mind slowly. Yet there is no panic here, only awareness. Someone nearby exhales deeply, rolling slightly onto their side. The movement sends a small ripple through shared bedding. You feel warmth shift, then settle again. The system adapts. In some regions, builders added layers of straw or bark above the ceiling to absorb moisture before it reached the living space. In others, sloped ceilings directed condensation toward the walls where it could be managed. You glance upwards again and notice the slight angle, the way the drip chose an edge, rather than falling directly down. That was not a luck. You close your eyes and focus on sensation rather than sound. The air against your face, the weight of earth above, the steady presence of others. Moisture is part of this environment, but it has not taken control. As sleep returns, it does so lightly at first. You hover between awareness and rest, ready to respond if the drip returns. This alertness does not feel exhausting. It feels appropriate. Underground sleep is not the surrender. It is cooperation. Gradually your body decides the balance is acceptable. The drip does not resume. The bowl remains quiet. The walls hold. You allow yourself to sink deeper, trusting that if moisture demands attention again, you will know. The ground beneath you cools slowly, but not dangerously. Bedding remains dry enough. Breath remains easy. The shelter continues its careful conversation with winter, one drop at a time. And somewhere between listening and dreaming, you learn that sleeping underground is not about eliminating discomfort. It is about noticing it early, responding calmly, and then returning to rest before fear has a chance to speak. You become aware of the air long before it becomes a problem. It announces itself quietly through effort rather than alarm. Breathing feels slightly thicker than it did earlier, as if each inhale has weight. Not enough to worry you, just enough to notice. Underground air is not invisible. It is something you monitor the way others monitor weather. You sit up a little and take a slower breath, paying attention to how it moves through your chest. The fire is low now, nearly finished with its work for the night. That helps. Too much flame would steal oxygen greedily. Too little would leave the cold unchecked. Balance again. Many 19th century accounts treated air as a daily concern in enclosed shelters mentioned alongside food and fuel rather than comfort. People understood that fresh air could not be taken for granted below ground. Vent holes, cracks, and narrow chimneys were lifelines, not afterthoughts. You feel gratitude for them now, even without seeing them clearly. Someone near the wall shifts and reaches upward, brushing fingers near the vent opening. A faint draft responds, barely perceptible but real. The air moves just enough to reassure. No one speaks. The exchange between hand and airflow is enough. You lie back again, breathing more slowly, matching the pace of the shelter. Quick breaths waste warmth and increase demand. Slow ones conserve both. This is not something anyone taught you explicitly. The environment teaches it for you. A lesser-known detail appears in several winter survival recollections, noting that people sometimes cracked doors or vent covers briefly even during severe cold choosing. Short discomfort over the long danger. You imagine the moment now, a rush of icy air cutting through warmth followed by relief as stale air escapes. It feels like a decision made with steady nerves. The air carries a familiar blend of scents now. Earth, smoke residue, wool, human presence. It's not fresh in any modern sense, but it is breathable. That distinction matters more than purity. You take another slow breath and feel your chest rise without resistance. There has been thoughtful discussion among historians about whether underground dwellers experienced more respiratory illness due to enclosed air. Some point to dampness and smoke exposure as risks. Others note that reduced wind and stable temperatures may have offered protective benefits. Lying here, you suspect both outcomes existed, shaped by how carefully a shelter was maintained. You listen for signs that the air is changing. A sudden headache, a tightness and yeast in the throat. None arrive. Instead, there is only the steady rhythm of breathing around you. Others seem at ease. That collective calm becomes another signal you trust. Someone coughs once quietly, then settles. It does not linger. You do not tense. Single coughs happen for many reasons. Underground people learn to distinguish between moments and patterns. You shift your position slightly so your face is angled toward where you know airflow moves best. You learn that without realizing it. Night by night, your body has mapped the shelter, noting where warmth pools and where air refreshes. Sleep here is not passive, it is embodied. A subtle change passes through the space as someone opens the vent just a little wider. Cold air slides in thin and sharp, then disperses quickly. You feel it brush your cheek, then fade. The exchange leaves the air feeling lighter, easier to draw in. The vent is closed again, sealing the balance. Your thoughts drift briefly to how rarely modern sleep requires this kind of awareness. You trust systems you cannot see. Here, systems are visible, tactile, responsive. Responsibility rests close to the body. Some period observers remark that people sleeping underground developed a heightened sensitivity to air quality, noticing changes long before they became dangerous. You believe that now? The shelter teaches you what to feel for and your body listens. You settle deeper into bedding, confident that air is moving as it should. Breathing slows further, lengthening the space between thoughts. The earlier heaviness has passed. What remains is a steady, livable atmosphere. The earth above you continues to press down, but it does not suffocate. It insulates, it contains. Air flows where it must, slowly, respectfully, like a guest who knows when to enter and when to leave. As sleep takes hold again, you stop thinking about breath entirely. That is the sign everything is working. When air fades from awareness, safety has been achieved. You drift off, held by soil, warmed by bodies and sustained by air that moves just enough to keep you alive without ever demanding attention. In a winter that asks so much that quiet cooperation feels like a gift, you wake without knowing why, and for a moment you cannot tell whether it is night or morning. There is no glow to guide you, no gradual brightening to negotiate with. Darkness underground does not fade politely. It simply remains until someone decides otherwise. You blink a few times, waiting for your eyes to adjust, then realize they already have. This is as adjusted as they will get. The space around you is familiar now, mapped by memory rather than sight. You know where the wall curves inward. You know where the ceiling dips. You know how far you can extend your arm before touching someone else's shoulder. Time behaves differently here. Without sunrise or sunset to divide it, hours lose their edges. People in the 19th century often remark that underground living altered their sense of day and night, making routine more important than clocks. You understand that now as you lie still trying to decide whether it is time to rise or time to turn over and rest more. You listen. Breathing around you is slow and even. No one is stirring yet. That suggests night still holds. You shift slightly, pulling bedding closer and let your eyes close again. Sleep comes back easily as if it had simply been waiting for permission. When you wake the second time, the feeling is different. There is a subtle change in the air. Not brighter, but lighter. Someone nearby is moving carefully, trying not to disturb others. You hear the faint scrape of a bowl being set down, the quiet rustle of fabric. Morning then, or at least the decision to make it morning. Underground days begin by agreement rather than by light. One person wakes, then another. Tasks follow, not because the sun demands them, but because bodies do. Hunger, stiffness, routine. These become the markers of time. You sit up slowly, rubbing warmth back into your hands. The fire is coaxed back to life with practiced restraint. Its glow returns gentle and controlled, revealing familiar shapes rather than illuminating anything new. The shelter looks the same as it did hours ago. Darkness has preserved it. A small but telling observation appears in several period accounts, noting that people often slept longer underground even if rest was lighter. Without early light forcing wakefulness, bodies followed their own rhythms more closely. You feel that now. Despite waking twice, you do not feel exhausted. You feel rested in a quiet, steady way. You take a moment to orient yourself, mentally listing tasks ahead. Bedding will need attention. Ventilation checked. Tools prepared. This mental ordering replaces the visual cues you might expect. Planning happens inwardly first. There has been scholarly discussion about whether the absence of natural light contributed to disorientation or whether strong routines compensated effectively. The answer seems to vary by household and personality. For you, routine feels grounding rather than restrictive. It gives shape to time that would otherwise blur. Someone lights up the small lantern briefly, just enough to inspect a corner of the shelter. The light feels almost intrusive after so much darkness. Shadows jump sharply, then settle. The lantern is extinguished again quickly. There is no need to waste fuel or disrupt adjusted eyes. You notice how your body responds to the return of light. Not eagerly, not reluctantly, simply neutrally. Darkness has not become something to escape. It has become a condition you work within. A peculiar detail appears in a handful of underground dwelling descriptions, mentioning that people sometimes forgot what day of the week it was during long winter stretches. Sundays lost their distinction. Workdays blurred together. What mattered was not the calendar, but the weather and the condition of the shelter. You smile faintly at the thought. It feels plausible here. You stand carefully, bending instinctively, and begin the slow work of morning. Movement brings circulation back into stiff limbs. The ground beneath your feet feels cold but stable. You stretch gently, mindful of the ceiling, and feel your spine lengthen just enough. As others wake fully, the shelter fills with quiet motion. No one rushes. There is time, or at least the illusion of it. Without visible daylight racing across the sky, urgency softens. Tasks are completed steadily rather than quickly. You glance towards the ceiling again, half expecting light to appear through soil. It does not. That expectation fades. You no longer look for sunrise here. You look for readiness. Time underground is measured by needs met and problems avoided, by warmth maintained, by air kept fresh, by bodies waking able to move. Those are the true hours that matter. As the morning settles in, you realize that darkness has not stolen time from you. It has simply rearranged it. And in doing so, it has taught you to sleep and wake by something older than clocks or light. You adjust your clothing, take a steady breath, and join the quiet rhythm of another underground day, shaped not by the sun, but by the simple agreement that rest has ended, and living must begin again. Something stirs beneath the quiet, subtle enough that you almost miss it. A faint scratch, then stillness. You do not open your eyes right away. Underground small sounds arrive without urgency. They are part of the agreement you have made with this place. You turn your head slightly and listen again. There it is. Another soft movement closer this time, followed by a pause that feels deliberate. Animals do not burst into underground shelters with drama. They test, they wait, they decide. People who lived this way in the 19th century understood that going underground meant accepting additional residents, most of them small and persistent. Mice insects, sometimes snakes, depending on region and season. These were not surprises. They were expected consequences of warmth and shelter. You feel that understanding settle in you, now replacing the instinctive tension you might feel elsewhere. The sound resumes a light scuffle near the wall, where stored materials rest. Someone nearby shifts slightly, not alarmed, just aware. A hand moves, placing an object closer to the ground. A quiet deterrent rather than a confrontation. Underground energy is conserved even in annoyance. You open your eyes and peer into the dimness. Shapes resolve slowly. Nothing looks disturbed. Bedding remains intact. Food is stored away, carefully sealed as best as possible. That alone limits how bold animal visitors become. Experience has taught people what attracts trouble and what keeps it manageable. An interesting aside appears in several homestead recollections describing how families developed a sort of truce with underground wildlife. Total exclusion was unrealistic. Instead, boundaries were maintained gently. Certain corners were tolerated. Others were protected fiercely. You sense that balance at work now. The scratching stops. Whoever was curious has decided against further exploration. You relax again, shoulders easing. Fear does not linger. It would serve no purpose here. You think briefly about how differently animals experience this space. For them, it is an extension of their own world. Burrows and tunnels are familiar terrain. Your shelter is simply a larger version, warmer and more complex. That thought reframes the encounter. You're not being invaded, you're overlapping. There has been discussion among researchers about whether underground shelters increase the risk of pests or whether stable temperatures actually discourage some infestations. Evidence points in both directions depending on region and construction. Lying here, you suspect maintenance mattered more than structure. Cleanliness, storage and vigilance made the difference. Another faint sound, this time closer to the fire pit. Ash shifts slightly. A small creature retreats quickly, startled by its own proximity to warmth. You almost smile. Even animals respect fire. Someone reaches out and adjusts a piece of cloth near the wall, blocking a narrow gap. The movement is smooth, practiced. This is not the first time it has happened. It will not be the last. Underground life trains patience in small repetitive acts. A peculiar note in a few frontier letters mentions that children often named recurring animal visitors, treating them as fixtures rather than threats. You imagine that here names whispered in the dark, familiarity easing fear. Survival does not always require dominance. Sometimes it requires coexistence. The shelter settles again into near silence. Breathing resumes its steady rhythm. Warmth redistributes. Whatever briefly shared the space has moved on or curled up somewhere unnoticed. The night continues. You shift your position slightly, ensuring bedding remains tucked and dry. The ground beneath you feels unchanged, stable, reliable. That steadiness matters more than complete control. Underground, the line between inside and outside is thinner than you might expect. Soil is both wall and habitat. Accepting that reality seems to make nights easier. Resistance would only heighten awareness. As sleep approaches again, you realize that your tolerance has shifted. What once might have startled you now barely registers. Familiarity dulls fear and sharpens judgment. You know which sounds matter and which do not. The presence of animals does not disrupt your rest. Instead, it reminds you that warmth attracts life, that shelter by its nature invites others. You share space not because you're careless, but because you're alive. Your breathing slows once more. Muscles relax. The brief interruption fades into memory. The earth above and around you holds steady, indifferent to small movements within. Wrapped in shared warmth and accepted imperfection, you drift back into sleep, understanding that underground rest is never solitary. It is layered, negotiated, and quietly resilient, much like the people who chose it when winter offered no gentler alternatives. You notice it first in the small details: pause that lasts a little longer than usual, a breath that sounds heavier, less cooperative. Someone sits closer to the fire than they normally would and is extended even when warmth has already settled into the room. Illness underground rarely announces itself loudly. It arrives quietly and waits to be recognized. In enclosed winter shelters of the 19th century, sickness was not an abstract worry. It was a daily calculation. People knew that once illness took hold in a tight space, it could linger. Cold weakened bodies. Dampness encouraged discomfort. Fatigue lowered resistance. These were not theories discussed over tables. They were lessons learned through observation. You watch as someone moves with care slower than before. No one asks questions aloud. There is no need. Underground attention replaces interrogation. A blanket is shifted. A sleeping spot is repositioned closer to shared warmth. Food is passed, gently portioned in a way that offers nourishment without waste. You become aware of how quietly care happens here. There is no dramatic response, no panic. Instead, there is adjustment. The system flexes around the weaker point, redistributing warmth and effort. That response feels practiced, as if it has been rehearsed many times before without ever being formalized. Some 19th century household records make brief mention of how winter sickness was managed collectively in earth shelters, emphasizing rest and warmth above all else. Medicine, when available, was limited. Prevention mattered more. So did early recognition. You see that priority reflected now in the careful way movements slow around the affected person. You lie still listening, not out of fear but awareness. Underground illness does not spread through dramatic contact. It spreads through proximity and exhaustion. People know this even if they would not describe it that way. They conserve energy. They minimize unnecessary interaction. They keep air moving gently. Someone adjusts the vents slightly, letting in a breath of colder air. It is uncomfortable for a moment, then necessary. Freshness matters even when warmth is precious. You feel the chill brush past your cheek and then fade as it disperses. Balance returns. There has been ongoing discussion among historians about whether underground living increased vulnerability to illness or offered protection from harsh winter exposure. The evidence points in different directions depending on context. Stable temperatures reduce shock to the body. Enclosed air sometimes carried risk. Lying here, you sense how much depended on vigilance rather than structure alone. A small, almost tender detail appears in a few family letters describing how people slept in shifts near someone who was unwell, not necessarily to watch them, but to share warmth evenly through the night. You imagine that now, bodies rotating quietly and ensuring no one grows too cold or too isolated. The person nearest the fire coughs softly. It is not alarming, but it is noted. A hand reaches out briefly, resting against their shoulder, then withdraws. Contact is measured. Support without crowding. You feel admiration for that restraint. You think about how illness feels different in a place like this. There is no room to retreat entirely, no separate room to disappear into. Recovery happens in public among others who continue living and resting nearby. Privacy becomes thinner, but support thickens in response. Another movement draws your attention. Someone places a small container near the ill person, something warm, perhaps water heated earlier. It is set within easy reach, not pressed upon them. Choice is preserved even in care. Some researchers have suggested that the visible communal management of illness fostered a heightened sense of responsibility within households. Others argue it increased stress. Watching now, you suspect it did both. Awareness can be heavy, but it can also be grounding. You adjust your own bedding, slightly creating more space without withdrawing completely. This is not avoidance. It is adaptation. Underground living teaches nuance. You learn to read situations rather than react to them. The shelter remains quiet but not tense. Breath moves. Fire glows low. The walls hold steady. Illness has not taken control. It has been acknowledged and folded into the rhythm of the night. A curious observation appears in one winter diary, noting that people often slept more lightly when someone was sick, not from fear but from attentiveness. You feel that now as your rest hovers closer to the surface. You're not fully awake, you're not fully asleep, you're available. Hours pass this way, measured not by darkness but by subtle shifts in sound and movement. Eventually the coughing eases, breathing evens out, the fire dims further. Someone checks the vent one last time, then settles back. Your body relaxes in response. The threat, such as it was, has softened. Not resolved perhaps, but stabilized. That is enough for the night. As you drift again toward deeper rest, you realize that illness undersound is not treated as an interruption. It is treated as a condition the shelter must absorb and respond to. Just like cold, just like dampness, just like hunger. The earth above continues to press down unchanged. Inside bodies adapt quietly, redistributing warmth, attention, and care until balance returns. You sleep knowing that if weakness comes to you next, the same system will adjust around you. And that knowledge, more than medicinal walls, offers a deep and steady comfort in a winter that allows little margin for error. You wake slowly, not pulled upward by light, but nudged awake by habit. Your body seems to know it is time before your thoughts catch up. Muscles shift, breath deepens. Somewhere nearby, someone exhales and sits up, setting the tone for the rest of you without saying a word. Morning underground never arrives with ceremony. There is no sky-changing colour, no beam of sun sneaking through a crack. Instead, morning happens when stillness gives way to motion. When the quiet becomes active rather than restful. You feel that change now, subtle but unmistakable. You open your eyes to the same darkness you fell asleep in. It no longer feels disorienting. It feels familiar, like waking in a room you know well with the lights off. You know where you are by texture and proximity rather than sight. You know where the wall curves. You know how far your arm can reach before touching bedding that is not yours. Accounts from the 19th century often mention that people living underground learned to rise by routine rather than daylight, guided by hunger, stiffness, and the need to tend essentials. You sense all three now. Your stomach feels hollow. Your joints ask to be moved. The fire needs attention. You sit up carefully, rolling your shoulders to ease the night's stiffness. The ceiling feels close but not oppressive. It simply reminds you to move deliberately. Someone else has already stirred the embers, coaxing a small glow back into existence. The light is faint, but it is enough. Firelight underground does not flood the space. It reveals it in pieces. A hand, a bowl, the edge of a blanket. You watch the shelter reassemble itself in fragments, familiar shapes returning one by one. Nothing looks new. Everything looks ready. You stand slowly bending without thinking about it now. Your body has learned the limits. You stretch as much as the ceiling allows, feeling your spine lengthen in increments. Circulation returns, chased by a brief sting of cold that fades as movement continues. Someone hands you a cup of something warm, water perhaps heated earlier. It is not elaborate, but it is welcome. You cradle it in both hands, letting warmth seep back into fingers that stiffened overnight. Mornings here begin with warmth first, food second. That order matters. There is a practical truth noted in several winter journals that people often delayed leaving underground shelters until absolutely necessary, preferring to complete as many tasks as possible below the frost line. You understand why as you sip slowly. Above ground, the cold will demand effort immediately. Down here, effort can be measured. Bedding is addressed next. Layers are lifted, shaken, gently rearranged to release trapped moisture. You help without being asked. Everyone does. Sleeping surfaces are not personal property. They are shared resources that require maintenance. The ground beneath them feels colder in the morning, but not hostile, just honest. As tasks unfold, conversation remains sparse. A few quiet exchanges pass between people, mostly logistical. Who will check the vent? Who will gather fuel? Who will step outside first? Words are chosen carefully, not out of tension but economy. There's been thoughtful discussion among scholars about whether the absence of morning light affected mood and motivation during long winters. Some suggest it dulled enthusiasm. Others argue it reduced pressure, allowing days to unfold more gently. Standing here, you feel neither rushed nor heavy. The morning simply exists. A lantern is lit briefly so someone can inspect a corner of the ceiling. Its glow feels sharp after so much darkness. Shadows jump the then settle. The lantern is extinguished again quickly. No one lingers in its light. Darkness has become the default, not something to escape. A small, almost humorous detail appears in a few personal recollections, describing how people sometimes misjudge the time of day underground beginning. Morning tasks only to realize later it was still very early. You smile at the thought. Without the sun, time becomes elastic. It stretches and compresses as needed. You prepare yourself mentally for going above ground. Layers are added, scarves adjusted, gloves checked. Every item has a purpose, nothing decorative remains. This preparation happens slowly, deliberately, as if extending it might delay the inevitable. Before anyone leaves the shelter, is made ready for its temporary emptiness. Fire is banked carefully, vents adjusted, loose soil pressed back into any weak spots discovered overnight. The shelter is treated almost like a living thing that must be settled before being left alone. You pause for a moment, taking in the space as it is now. Quiet, warm enough, stable. This place has held you through the night again. That fact feels significant. You place a hand briefly against the wall, feeling its cool steadiness. There is ongoing debate among historians about whether underground shelters fostered stronger attachments to place compared to more temporary surface structures. From where you stand, attachment feels less sentimental and more practical. Gratitude grows from reliability. Someone climbs the steps toward the exit. Cold air spills down briefly, sharp and bracing. It carries the smell of snow and open space. You feel it against your face and instinctively draw your clothing closer. The opening is closed again, sealing the underground calm. You take a final sip from the cup in your hands and pass it along. There is no rush. Morning will wait. Winter above will not soften just because you hurry. When it is your turn to move toward the exit, you do so with purpose, not reluctance. Underground sleep has done its work. You are rested enough, warm enough, ready enough. You climb carefully, feeling the change in temperature with each step. The shelter remains behind you, quiet and waiting. It will be there when you return, unchanged, holding the night until it is needed again. And as you emerge into the cold, you carry with you the calm that only a morning without sunrise can teach. Time does not need light to move forward. It only needs bodies willing to rise and continue. Once you are fully awake, the shelter no longer feels like a place meant only for sleep. It becomes a workspace, compressed but efficient, shaped by habit rather than comfort. You crouch near the wall and reach for tools stored where they will not freeze solid overnight. Everything has a place because there is nowhere to set things down casually. Daily tasks underground are quieter than you expect. Movements are small. Sounds are absorbed almost immediately. You kneel to sort through supplies, fingers stiff at first, then gradually loosening as warmth returns. Food is checked carefully. Anything that might spoil or draw animals is inspected. adjusted, moved if necessary. Underground storage keeps some things fresher than surface sheds, but moisture complicates that advantage. In many rural communities during the 19th century, people relied on underground spaces not just for sleeping, but for preparing meals, repairing tools, and even caring for animals during extreme cold. These spaces were not retreats, they were hubs. You feel that purpose now as work begins without anyone announcing it. Someone hardens the blade with slow, even strokes. The sound is soft, rhythmic, almost soothing. Another person mends a tearing clothing needle moving steadily through thick fabric. There is no wasted motion. Every action is measured against how much energy it costs and how much benefit it returns. You are given a simple task and complete it without complaint. There is satisfaction in finishing something practical so early. Underground productivity is not about speed, it is about readiness. Completing small tasks now prevents larger problems later, when cold or exhaustion would make them harder. A detail occasionally mentioned in winter correspondence describes how people preferred to handle delicate work below ground where wind could not interfere and hands could stay warm longer. You understand that immediately. Your fingers are clumsy enough as it is. A draft would undo what little dexterity you have. The air shifts as more people move. Ventilation is adjusted slightly to account for activity. More motion means more breath, more heat, more moisture. The shelter responds slowly, but it does respond. You learn to anticipate these changes, opening space before discomfort arrives rather than after. There has been thoughtful disagreement among historians about whether underground living reduced daily productivity due to cramped conditions, or increased it by conserving energy otherwise lost to cold exposure. Watching the quiet efficiency around you, you lean toward the latter. Nothing here feels rushed, but nothing feels idle either. You squat near the fire pit and help clear ash, careful not to stir up dust unnecessarily. Ash is not waste. It is saved for later use, tucked into a container near the wall. Everything has a second purpose. Everything is kept until it cannot be kept anymore. As you work, conversation drifts in and out. Short exchanges, practical questions, occasional humour that lands softly, never rising above the low ceiling. Laughter underground sounds different. It is shorter, gentler, as if it knows not to linger too long. A small but memorable observation appears in a handful of settler diaries, noting that underground workspaces felt strangely calm even during stressful periods. The absence of visual clutter and outside noise allowed focus to narrow naturally. You feel that calm now. Your thoughts stay close to your hands. You notice how often the people check the walls and ceiling while working. A glance here, a press there. Maintenance happens, continuously folded into other tasks. There is no designated time for inspection. It is always happening. You pause briefly to stretch, mindful of the ceiling. Your muscles ache, pleasantly warmed by the movement. This kind of labour does not exhaust. It steadies. Above ground, cold would bite at every pause. Down here, pauses feel earned. Someone prepares a small meal without ceremony. Food is simple, eaten where you stand or crouch. There is no table. There is no need. Eating underground feels more like refueling than dining. You take a few bites, chew slowly, feel warmth spread. Some researchers have proposed that underground living blurred the boundaries between work and rest more than surface living did. Tasks flowed into each other without clear divisions. Looking around now, that seems accurate. There is no sharp line between morning chores and preparation for night. Everything feeds into everything else. You finish your task and move aside so someone else can take your place. Space is shared fluidly. No one claims a spot for long. The shelter feels alive with quiet motion, like a hive operating at a deliberate pace. A faint sound reaches you from above. Perhaps a gust of wind, perhaps a branch shifting under snow. You register it, then return your focus below. Underground work trains attention downward rather than outward. As the morning progresses, the shelter gradually empties. One by one, people prepare to head above ground to tend animals, gather fuel or check conditions. Those who remain continue working without interruption. The shelter never feels abandoned. It simply adjusts to fewer bodies. You take one last look around before stepping toward the exit yourself. Tools are stored. Bedding is arranged loosely to air. Fire is banked carefully. The space is left ready, not pristine. Readiness matters more than order. There has been ongoing scholarly discussion about whether underground spaces fostered a stronger sense of cooperation within households. Observing this morning routine, you find that question almost unnecessary. Cooperation is not an abstract value here. It is built into the architecture. You climb toward the opening, feeling the temperature drop with each step. Cold air spills downward again, sharp and clean. You brace yourself, pulling clothing tighter. Before leaving, you glance back once more. The shelter remains behind you, dim and quiet, holding the imprint of work just complete. It will warm again when bodies return. It will adjust again when night falls. It will ask for attention, patience, and respect. As you step out into the cold, you carry with you the steady rhythm learned below ground. Work done without haste. Effort shared without comment. A space that teaches you how to live smaller so winter does not feel quite so large. You notice the difference in bodies before anyone mentions it aloud. Height, reach, strength, speed. Underground, those differences matter in quiet ways. Space compresses everyone equally, but the work of adapting to it does not fall the same on every frame. Children move first, they always do. You watch them navigate the shelter with an ease that feels almost unfair. Crawling comes naturally. Ducking is instinctive. Their centre of gravity sits lower, closer to the ground that defines this place. What feels cramped to you feels appropriately scaled to them. In many households during the 19th century, young children adjusted to underground living faster than adults, a fact hinted at repeatedly in family letters and memoirs. Their bodies were still learning what normal meant, and underground space became part of that lesson. You see it now in the way they turn tight corners without slowing, and how they treat low ceilings as something to play beneath rather than resent. Women adapt differently but no less decisively. You observe how tasks are chosen and shifted to match strength and reach. Heavy lifting is shared. Repetitive work is rotated. No one announces these adjustments. They emerge naturally, shaped by long familiarity with each other's limits. You notice how posture changes over the time. Shoulders round slightly, knees bend more easily. Movements become economical, conserving effort. These are not signs of weakness, they are signs of learning. Bodies that fight the space tire quickly. Bodies that cooperate last longer. There is a practical truth often noted in rural accounts that underground shelters were organised around who needed warmth most. Infants, the elderly, and those recovering from a sickness slept closest to the most stable heat. Others positioned themselves outward, forming layers of protection. You see that pattern clearly now. It's not sentimental, it is logistical. You watch a woman guide a child's hand away from a sharp edge without scolding, without drawing attention. Safety lessons underground are delivered quietly, repeatedly, until they become reflex. There is no room for dramatic correction. Mistakes cost too much. Men adjust too, though, sometimes more slowly. You notice how taller individuals learn to bend automatically, how they stop straightening fully even when space allows it. Pride sheds itself quickly when bruised foreheads become routine. Underground living humbles everyone eventually. There has been sustained discussion among social historians about whether underground living reinforced traditional roles or blurred them out of necessity. The evidence suggests both occurred depending on circumstance. Standing here, you see roles defined less by expectation and more by who can do what without wasting energy. You kneel to help with a task that requires patience rather than strength. Fingers move carefully, eyes focus on detail. Someone else takes over a heavier job nearby. The exchange happens without comment. Underground efficiency outranks hierarchy. A small but revealing detail appears in a handful of period recollections, noting that pregnancy was managed carefully in earth's shelters, with sleeping positions adjusted and tasks redistributed to reduce strain. You notice how attentively others watch one woman's movements, now offering help before she asks. Care is woven into routine rather than treated as exception. Children learn early where they are allowed to be and where they are not. Boundaries are enforced by habit rather than fences. They know which wall sections are fragile, which tools are not toys, which corners belong to supplies. That knowledge settles into them as naturally as the language. You listen to how voices change underground. Louder tones flatten quickly. Sharp words echo unpleasantly. Nay, people learn to speak in lower registers, not because they are told to, but because the space rewards it. Children mimic this without instruction. Volume becomes another thing shaped by environment. There is an interesting observation found in some settlement studies suggesting that underground living altered perceptions of strength, valuing endurance and steadiness over raw power. Watching now, you see how someone who moves slowly but consistently contributes more than someone who rushes and tires. You feel your own body adapting further. Knees bend more willingly. You choose routes that require fewer adjustments. Your sense of space sharpens. You know where others are even without seeing them. Awareness expands to compensate for limited room. The shelter holds all these bodies without distinction, yet it does not erase difference. Instead, it makes difference visible and useful. Each body finds a way to belong through contribution. There has been academic disagreement about whether children raised in underground dwellings experience developmental delays due to limited space and light. Other researchers argue that strong social interaction and constant engagement offset those concerns. Observing the alertness and coordination around you, you suspect environment alone never tells the full story. A child laughs softly at something small, then clamps a hand over their mouth, glancing around instinctively. Sound awareness has already taken root. The laughter does not disappear. It simply changes shape, contained rather than suppressed. You help guide someone through a tight passage, placing a hand briefly on their elbow. The contact is practical and remarkable. Touch underground is often functional rather than affectionate, though it carries reassurance all the same. As the day progresses, you see how fatigue appears differently across bodies. Children grow restless first, older joints stiffen earlier. Strength wanes unevenly, tasks shift again to accommodate that. Nothing here is fixed for long. One understated detail found in winter narratives describes how underground shelters often became places where elders shared instruction, their slower pace fitting naturally into the environment. You notice that now, as someone older demonstrates a repair, and steady movements precise. Attention gathers around them without being summoned. You reflect on how surface life often exaggerates difference. Height, speed, force. Underground, those markers soften. What matters is adaptability, awareness, and willingness to move with others. As evening approaches, again bodies begin to orient toward rest. Children settle sooner. Adults follow gradually. Bedding is rearranged once more, positions chosen with care. The familiar pattern resumes. You take your place among them, feeling how your own body now fits the space more easily than it did days ago. Limits that once felt imposed now feel understood. Underground life does not erase individuality. It reshapes it around shared survival. Everybody learns where it belongs, not by being told, but by listening to what the space allows. As you lie down, you sense how this quiet accommodation of difference makes the shelter stronger. Not uniform, but balanced, not equal, but attentive. In winter, that balance is what carries everyone through the night again. The first story begins without an announcement. No one clears their throat. No one asks for attention. A sentence simply appears in the darkness, spoken into the low air as if it's been waiting there already. You do not turn your head. You do not sit up. Listening underground does not require posture. Voices behave differently here. They do not travel far, they settle. A word spoken softly still reaches everyone, not because it is loud, but because the space has nowhere else for it to go. The shelter holds the sound and passes it along gently like warmth. Storytelling in winter shelters was often described in passing rather than highlighted as an event. Letters and diaries mention it as something that happened naturally when work slowed and darkness lingered. You understand why. Stories are not entertainment here. They are pacing tools. They stretch the night into something manageable. The voice continues, describing a journey taken years ago. The details are simple: a road, a storm, a mistake that almost mattered. You realize quickly that accuracy is not the point. The rhythm is. The familiar rise and fall of memory fills the dark with shape. Someone else adds a detail, quietly correcting or embellishing. No one objects. Underground stories are collaborative by necessity. Memory overlaps. Truth bends slightly to fit the space. What matters is that the telling continues. You feel your breathing slow as the cadence settles in. Stories here are not rushed. Pauses are allowed to stretch. Silence is not interruption. It is part of the structure. The fire responds with a faint pop, then returns to stillness. An overlooked but telling observation appears in several winter recollections, noting that storytelling often replaced structured prayer or reading in households where light and books were scarce. Oral memory carried knowledge forward more reliably than paper could. Listening now, you feel how information embeds itself more deeply when carried by voice. The story shifts into something lighter. A small misfortune made amusing by time. Someone chuckles softly. The sound is brief, careful not to ripple too far. Humor underground is measured. It warms without overheating. You notice how faces look different in the fire's low glow. Shadows soften features. Expressions blur at the edges. Listening becomes easier when you're not distracted by detail. You follow the voice rather than the speaker. That feels intentional. There has been thoughtful analysis by cultural historians about whether winter storytelling served primarily as education, entertainment, or emotional regulation. The categories blur here. A story teaches without lecturing. It distracts without wasting time. It calms without dulling awareness. A child asks a question quietly, not interrupting so much as joining. The answer comes folded into the story itself. Learning happens sideways underground, absorbed rather than delivered. You notice how stories tend to circle back on themselves. Themes repeat. Storms, mistakes, survival, kindness offered at the right moment. These are not random. They reinforce values without spelling them out. In a place where the margin for error is thin, reminders matter. A curious detail mentioned in a few regional accounts describes how people sometimes told the same story many times, across a single winter, refining it each telling. Repetition was not boredom, it was reinforcement. You sense that happening now as familiar phrases resurface, comforting in their predictability. The shelter seems to lean into the sound. Even the walls feel closer when stories are told, as if the earth itself is listening. You imagine these same tales pressing into the soil, lingering long after voices fade. Someone's voice grows tired and trails off. Another picks up, seamlessly shifting to a different memory. There is no formal handoff. The dark allows transitions without ceremony. Attention flows where it needs to go. You feel your body sinking deeper into bedding. Muscles relax further. Stories give your mind something to rest against while your body lets go. This balance feels important. Sleep arrives more easily when the mind is gently occupied. There has been disagreement among scholars about whether storytelling delayed sleep or improved it in underground environments. Some argue that engagement kept listeners alert. Others suggest it eased anxiety and smoothed the transition into rest. As your eyelids grow heavy, you suspect the latter was often the case. The fire dims again. No one tends it. The story has taken over its role for now, holding the space together with sound instead of heat. Breath moves slowly. The shelter feels full without being crowded. Another story begins quieter this time. It is less detailed, more reflective. The kind of story that does not require full attention to be effective. You catch fragments, a name, a pace, a decision that mattered. Your thoughts begin to drift between listening and dreaming. The voice becomes a current you float on rather than a thing you analyze. Words blur into tone, meaning softens into reassurance. A small but meaningful note appears in some winter journals mentioning that people often fell asleep during stories and woke later without feeling they had missed anything. Stories were not performances. They were environments. You experience that now as your awareness dips and rises. The voice fades gradually, not to silliness, but to murmured endings that taper off on their own. No one announces the conclusion, the night absorbs it. Silence returns, but it is different now, thicker, kinder. The stories have smoothed the edges of darkness, made it less empty. You breathe slowly, deeply, no longer counting. The shelter feels settled. The earth above presses gently. The fire rests. As sleep finally takes hold, you realize the stories have done exactly what they were meant to do. They have filled the dark without overwhelming it. They have connected bodies without demanding attention. They have carried memory forward and then stepped aside. You drift off, held not just by soil and warmth, but by voices that linger in the space even after they stop speaking. In a winter where nights stretch long and heavy, stories become another layer of insulation. And wrapped in that quiet narrative warmth, you sleep again steady and untroubled, until the dark is ready to release you. Silence arrives gradually, not as an absence, but as a skill. You notice it in the way voices taper off before fully forming, in how movements become smaller, more deliberate. Underground quiet is not imposed, it is learned. You lie still and listen to what remains, breathing, the faint settling of earth, the soft brush of fabric when someone shifts position. None of these sounds compete, they coexist. Over time you begin to recognize which noises matter and which can be ignored safely. People who live through long winters below ground often described silence as something cultivated rather than endured. It served practical purposes. Loud noise wasted energy, startled animals, and made it harder to hear subtle warnings from the structure itself. You sense that priority now, as stillness settles around you like another layer of bedding. Your body adjusts to this quiet in stages. At first, thoughts fill the gap, racing to occupy the space noise once held. Then those thoughts thin out, slowed by the steady rhythm of breath nearby. Silence becomes less empty and more supportive, like a wall you can lean against. Someone clears their throat softly, then stops. The sound feels larger than it should, lingering in the low ceiling. No one reacts, but you feel a shared awareness ripple through the group. Volume matters here. Sound travels differently underground, not far, but fully. There is nowhere for it to dissipate. A practical observation scattered through the winter diaries notes that people learn to communicate more through gesture and timing than speech in enclosed shelters. A hand movement, a pause, a shared glance in firelight. You see that language at work now. Needs are met without words. You adjust your position slightly, careful to avoid unnecessary noise. Bedding shifts with a muted sigh. The shelter accepts it without complaint. You feel a small sense of satisfaction in having moved without disruption. Silence rewards restraint. There has been scholarly reflection on whether prolonged quiet sharpened awareness or dulled it. Some suggest it heightened sensitivity to small changes. Others argue it encouraged withdrawal. Lying here, you feel more alert rather than less. Silence has tuned your attention rather than numbed it. A faint sound reaches you from above, a distant creak, snow perhaps sliding from a roof. You notice it immediately, then file it away. It does not repeat. The shelter remains stable. Silence returns intact. You realize that quiet underground carries responsibility. Without constant noise, every sound has meaning. People listen more carefully because they must. The shelter speaks softly, and you have learned how to hear it. A small, almost playful detail appears in a few recollections, describing how people sometimes challenge themselves to move without making any sound at all, especially children. It became a game that doubled as training. You smile faintly at the thought, imagining soft laughter quickly swallowed by darkness. Your breathing deepens again. Each inhale feels measured. Each exhale releases tension without noise. Even your thoughts seem to lower their volume, drifting instead of colliding. You become aware of how much modern life fills silence, immediately treating it as something to be solved. Here, silence solves things for you. It steadies nerves, it preserves warmth, it makes sleep easier to reach. Someone nearby rolls onto their side. The movement is slow, careful. You feel warmth shift, then settle again. No one stirs fully. Silence absorbs the change. There has been disagreement among researchers about whether such quiet increased anxiety during isolation. Others argue it provided relief from constant vigilance required above ground. From where you lie, the quiet feels protective rather than oppressive. It wraps the shelter in a sense of control. You listen again, not searching for sound, but confirming its absence. That absence feels earned. It is the result of cooperation, of shared understanding about how to exist together in a small space without friction. The fire has burned down to embers. They glow faintly, then dim. No one tends them. It is not needed. The shelter holds enough warmth for now. Silence takes over the role of guardian alert without being intrusive. Your muscles loosen further. Jaw unclenches, hands relax against fabric. The quiet allows your body to stand down from readiness without losing awareness completely. A final thought drifts through your mind before sleep deepens. Silence here is not loneliness. It is company of a different kind. It is the presence of others choosing restraint together. As you slip fully into rest, silence does not disappear. It remains holding the space steady while you sleep. Underground quiet is not the absence of life. It is proof that life has learned how to move gently enough to endure winter. You begin to notice differences, not because anyone explains them, but because the shelter itself feels slightly unfamiliar as stories pass from one place to another. Soil changes character from region to region, and with it the underground experience shifts in small but meaningful ways. Even without leaving this space, you sense that what you are living now is only one version of a broader pattern. In some areas, the earth is dense and heavy, packed with clay that holds shape stubbornly. Underground rooms there feel solid, almost carved rather than dug. In other regions, sandy soil demands constant attention, slumping if neglected, whispering reminders that maintenance is never finished. People who wrote about wintering underground often remarked on how the land itself dictated daily routines more than any written plan ever could. You imagine what this shelter would feel like elsewhere. In prairie regions, dugouts often stretched wider, their walls reinforced with sod blocks, cut thick and stacked carefully. In hillier ground spaces followed the slope half-buried rather than fully sunken. Each variation changed how people slept, how heat moved, how sound travelled through the walls at night. You run your hand along the wall again, and think about how much knowledge is embedded here. Not formal knowledge, not taught in classrooms, but knowledge earned through failure. A ceiling that did not collapse, a wall that did not seep water too quickly, a sleeping area placed just far enough from the entrance to avoid drafts. These choices echo similar ones made hundreds of miles away by people who never met, all answering the same problem in slightly different ways. There is a practical understanding passed quietly through experience that underground shelters were rarely identical even within the same region. Families adapted designs based on soil, available materials, and personal tolerance. One account from a traveller described moving between dugouts that felt vastly different despite serving the same purpose. You believe that now. This shelter has its own personality. Some historians have explored whether cultural traditions influenced underground design as much as environment did. Certain communities favoured rounder spaces, others squared corners. Some emphasised communal sleeping areas, others partitioned space as much as possible. Sitting here, you suspect both tradition and necessity worked together, shaping spaces that felt familiar as well as functional. A curious regional detail appears in scattered reports, mentioning that in colder northern areas, entrances were sometimes built with longer angled passages to trap cold air before it reached sleeping areas. You picture that now, a short tunnel acting like a buffer between worlds. The thought makes you grateful for how little cold reaches you here once the entrance closes. You listen again to how sound behaves. The earth around you absorbs it differently than stone would, differently than wood. In some places, underground shelters were nearly silent. In others, they carried faint echoes depending on wall composition. That variation shaped how people spoke, how loudly they laughed, how carefully they moved at night. There has been debate among scholars about whether underground shelters developed independently in different regions or spread through shared knowledge as people migrated. The similarities suggest a shared logic. The differences reveal local creativity. You feel part of that long conversation, now your body responding to choices made long before you arrived. You think about how sleep itself might change in these different spaces. A wider room allows more movement but loses heat faster. A narrower one holds warmth but restricts motion. Every design decision carries a trade-off that shapes rest in subtle ways. Here you have learned to sleep smaller, more contained. Elsewhere that lesson might differ. A small but telling anecdote from a traveller's journal describes someone feeling unsettled sleeping underground in unfamiliar soil, unable to trust its weight or smell. Familiarity mattered. The ground you know feels safer than ground you do not, even if both are equally stable. You understand that instinctively now. You shift slightly, feeling how the wall supports your back. This soil feels trustworthy. It has held through storms, snow, and repeated use. That trust makes rest easier. It allows you to let go more fully. As the night deepens again, you realize that underground life was never a single solution. It was a flexible answer, shaped by land, climate, and habit. People did not copy shelters blindly. They adapted, adjusted, and refined them over time. That adaptability feels like the true lesson carried beneath the surface. Survival underground was not about finding the perfect design. It was about paying attention and responding honestly to what the earth offered. You breathe slowly, grounded by that thought. Somewhere else, someone sleeps beneath different soil, listening to different sounds, feeling a different kind of pressure overhead. Yet the experience overlaps in important ways. The earth holds them as it holds you, in many forms, in many places, offering the same quiet promise. If you learn how to listen, it will keep winter at bay just long enough to rest. You notice it when you least expect to. A moment when your shoulders drop without effort, when your breathing slows not because you told it to, but because there is nothing left to brace against. The earth around you has stopped feeling like a weight and started feeling like a boundary. At first, being underground felt like being hidden. Now it feels like being held. This shift is subtle, easy to miss if you're not paying attention. It does not arrive with relief or celebration. It arrives as the absence of vigilance. You are no longer listening for every sound above. You are no longer measuring the cold with your spine. The shelter has proven itself enough times that your body begins to trust it. Many winter diaries from the 19th century hint at this change without naming it directly. People wrote about sleeping more deeply after several weeks below ground, about fear dulling into routine. They did not call it comfort. They called it getting used to things. You understand now that this adjustment was not resignation. It was psychological shelter forming alongside the physical one. You lie back and feel the ceiling's closeness again. Earlier it pressed on your thoughts, now it contains them. There is nowhere for worries to expand wildly. The space keeps them small, manageable, shaped to fit the moment. Tomorrow's problems remain tomorrow's problems. Tonight has already been solved. The earth muffles more than sound. It softens anticipation. Without windows or horizon, your mind stops scanning for change. There is no storm to watch approach, no sky to read. That absence reduces a certain kind of anxiety, the kind built on waiting for things to worsen. There has been thoughtful disagreement among scholars about whether enclosure calmed winter dwellers or intensified feelings of confinement. Some argue that being buried heightened fear. Others suggest it offered relief from exposure and uncertainty. From where you are lying, the answer feels conditional. Fear thrives on unpredictability. Underground conditions are limited and known. A small but striking observation appears in a few personal letters describing how people felt more unsettled sleeping above ground after long periods underground, bothered by wind and open space. You imagine that now, stepping into a cabin that creaks and breathes too loudly, here stillness has become normal. You listen again to the shelter's sounds. They are familiar now. Settling earth, slow breath, a faint creak that has never turned into anything worse. Familiar sounds stop triggering alertness. They become background like the sound of your own pulse. Your body responds accordingly, muscles loosen more fully, hands unclench. Even your jaw relaxes, something you did not realize had been tight. The Earth's pressure has become reassuring, a reminder that nothing is shifting unexpectedly. Some researchers have suggested that underground living created a sense of psychological compression that limited imagination and planning. Others argue it narrowed focus in a beneficial way, helping people conserve mental energy. Lying here, you feel the narrowing as a gift. Winter already asks enough. There is no need to think beyond what matters. You think about how open spaces invite projection. Skies suggest distance. Horizons encourage longing. Underground desire quiets. What you need is here. What you fear is mostly outside. A child nearby shifts in their sleep, murmuring softly. No one stirs. The sound passes through the space and fades. The shelter absorbs it easily. That ease feels important. Nothing demands response unless it truly requires it. You notice how your dreams have changed too. They are heavier, slower, less fragmented. Fewer sudden awakenings, fewer jolts of imagined danger. The Earth seems to steady not just your body but your sleeping mind. There has been discussion among historians of emotion about whether underground living reduced seasonal despair or deepened it. Evidence is mixed, shaped by isolation, duration, and social bonds. From your position among others, the social element feels decisive. Enclosure alone might feel stifling. Enclosure shared feels safe. You are not alone in this space. That fact changes everything. The walls hold everyone equally. Warmth circulates. Attention spreads naturally. There is no edge where one person bears the full burden of alertness. As sleep deepens again, you realize that the comfort you feel is not softness. It is reliability. The ground has behaved predictably. The shelter has done what it promised. That consistency allows your mind to rest. Above ground, winter remains vast and indifferent. Down here, its reach is shortened, pressed back by soil and cooperation. The world has been reduced to a size you can handle. Your breathing slows further. Thoughts fade gently rather than dropping away. The Earth does not demand gratitude. It simply continues to hold. And wrapped in that steady containment, you drift into another stretch of sleep calm. Not because danger is gone, but because it has been kept at a respectful distance by walls of packed soil and practiced trust. You sense the danger before you see it. The air carries a cooler edge than usual, not sharp enough to alarm, but different enough to notice. Dampness has a way of announcing itself early if you have learned how to listen. Tonight the ground feels slightly heavier, as if it is holding more than it should. Flooding underground is never sudden drama. It is a patient threat. Water seeps. It collects. It tests weak points quietly while people sleep or work. You remember hearing that many earth shelters in the 19th century were abandoned not because they collapsed, but because water slowly claimed them. That knowledge returns now as you sit up and place your palm against the floor. The soil feels cool and firm, not wet, not yet. Someone else has noticed the same thing. You see it in the way they glance toward the lower edge of the shelter where the ground slopes almost imperceptibly. A shallow channel runs there, shaped long ago with a careful hand. Its purpose is obvious now. It gives water somewhere to go that is not the sleeping area. You shift your bedding slightly uphill, a movement so small it barely registers. Others do the same. No one speaks. Flood awareness underground becomes instinctive over time. You learn where water prefers to travel. You learn which corners demand attention after heavy snow or sudden thaw. Accounts from winter settlements often describe water as the most exhausting enemy, not because it struck violently, but because it required constant watchfulness. Cold could be fought with fire and bodies. Water demanded shaping the earth itself. You feel that distinction now. The shelter is warm enough. It is dryness that must be defended. A faint trickle sounds near the entrance, subtle but real. Meltwater perhaps released by a brief rise in temperature above ground. Someone moves toward it quietly and presses soil into a low spot, redirecting the flow. The action is practiced efficient. This has happened before. There is an unusual detail mentioned in a few frontier recollections about people keeping spare earth piled inside during winter, specifically for emergency reshaping when water appeared. You notice that pile, now tucked against a wall, is present suddenly meaningful rather than incidental. You kneel and help guide water along the shallow channel, smoothing its path with your hands. The soil responds easily cooperative when handled early. This work is calm, almost meditative. Panic would only make it harder. Some researchers have debated whether underground shelters were inherently vulnerable to flooding, or whether skilled builders mitigated the risk effectively most of the time. From where you are kneeling, the answer feels conditional rather than absolute. Water can be managed, but only with attention and respect. The trickle slows. The channel does its job. Moisture disappears into the earth where it can spread harmlessly rather than pool. The immediate threat eases, but vigilance remains. Flooding is not defeated, it's postponed. You wipe your hands on your clothing and return to your place, aware now of how close the boundary is between shelter and hazard. The ground that protects you from cold can just as easily invite water if neglected. That dual nature commands respect. Someone checks the ceiling again, scanning for darker patches. None appear. The walls hold. The shelter breathes out a collective ease that is felt rather than spoken. You settle back down, pulling bedding close again. The ground beneath feels unchanged, still solid. Warmth has not been lost, only attention has been sharpened. There has been discussion among environmental historians about whether flooding fears shaped daily anxiety levels in underground dwellers. Some argue it was a constant background concern, others suggest experience reduced fear to manageable awareness. Lying here now, awareness feels like the better word. You're alert, not afraid. A small but telling note in a winter diary described how people slept lightly on thaw nights, half listening for water. You find yourself doing the same, hovering closer to the surface of sleep without fully waking. This state feels appropriate. It keeps you ready without stealing rest entirely. Gradually the air steadies. No new sounds emerge. The channel remains quiet. The shelter returns to its low hum of breath and stillness. You let your muscles loosen again, trusting that you will notice if conditions change. Underground sleep does not mean surrendering awareness. It means distributing it across everyone present. As you drift back toward deeper rest, you recognize how this constant negotiation shapes resilience. Flooding does not break the shelter tonight. It tests it, and the shelter responds. The earth remains firm beneath you. Water has been guided away. Winter presses on above, indifferent. Below, careful hands and shared attention have kept the night livable once more. You sleep again, knowing that safety underground is never static. It is maintained moment by moment, shaped by observation, patience, and the willingness to rise quietly when the ground begins to whisper. You become aware of it as the fire settles lower than usual. Not gone, just diminished, as if it has reached a decision on its own. The glow is still there, but thinner, stretched carefully across the hours. Firewood underground is never background scenery. It is arithmetic. Every piece burned is a piece not available later. That calculation lives quietly in everyone's mind. In many 19th century households, fuel was the most tightly managed resource of winter, more closely tracked than food in some cases. Wood took time and exposure to gather. Coal, where available, required transport and trade. Dung peat or dried roots filled gaps when forests were distant. You feel the weight of that reality now as someone studies the remaining fuel without touching it. No one adds wood immediately. The shelter is warm enough. Bodies are close. Walls are holding heat. Burning more now would be waste, not comfort. Underground living sharpens this judgment quickly. Warmth is not about maximum heat. It is about minimum loss. You watch as someone nudges embers closer together with a stick, tightening the glow rather than feeding it. The fire responds by brightening slightly without growing larger. This technique appears in scattered winter manuals and homestead advice, often described casually as if everyone already knew it. Fire underground is shaped more than it is fed. The air adjusts to the change. Smoke thins. Breathing feels easier. The shelter settles into a quieter balance. You realize that firewood management is not just about heat. It is about air moisture and timing. Everything connects. A small but striking detail mentioned in a few rural accounts describes families measuring winter fuel, not by days but by nights. Nights were when mistakes mattered. Nights were when fire choices determined whether people slept or shivered. You glance around now, counting the hours left until morning without meaning to. Someone shifts closer to you, sharing warmth rather than asking for more fire. That choice feels deliberate. Bodies substitute for fuel when possible. Cooperation stretches resources further than isolation ever could. There has been lively discussion among economic historians about whether underground living reduced fuel consumption significantly compared to surface dwellings. Some argue the insulation advantage was decisive. Others note that longer periods indoors increased overall use. Sitting here, you sense how intention matters as much as structure. The shelter makes efficiency possible. People make it real. You think about how fire is treated differently here than in open rooms. There is no spectacle, no pleasure in watching flames dance. Fire is almost kept low, encouraged to last rather than impress. That restraint feels learned rather than instinctive. Someone quietly removes a piece of partially burned wood and sets it aside to cool. It will be reused, later rekindled rather than wasted. Ashes collected carefully again. Nothing is discarded thoughtlessly. Even remnants have value. A curious observation appears in a winter letter, describing how people sometimes argued more about fuel than food, because hunger was familiar but cold felt unforgiving. You understand that instinctively. A missed meal weakens. A cold night threatens sleep, judgment, and health all at once. You pull your bedding closer and feel warmth respond. It is enough. Not generous, not scarce, enough. The fire does not need to be larger for that to be true. The shelter grows darker as embers dim further. Shadows soften. The ceiling recedes into suggestion rather than form. This darkness is intentional. Light consumes fuel. Darkness preserves it. Some researchers have proposed that the constant mental accounting of fuel-shaped winter behavior profoundly encouraging restraint in speech, movement, and emotion. Others argue people adapted so fully that the accounting faded into habit. Lying here, it feels like both. You're aware but not anxious. The math has become part of you. You notice how still everyone becomes as the fire reaches its lowest point. Movement slows, breathing deepens. The shelter seems to lean inward, holding warmth closer. Nothing feels tense. It feels deliberate. Outside, winter continues its work in different calculations below. Inside, choices have been made carefully enough that its reach remains limited. You drift closer to sleep again, trusting that if the temperature drops too far, someone will notice. That trust is earned through repetition. Night after night, the balance is held. The fire glows faintly, a quiet promise rather than a spectacle. Wood has been spared. Air remains clean. Bodies remain warm. And as your eyes close, you understand that fuel underground is not just a resource. It is a discipline. One that teaches patience, foresight, and the art of stopping before too much is taken. You feel the change not in the temperature but in the habits. Movements shift. Small routines adjust themselves without comment. Winter has settled into a deeper phase, and the shelter responds the way it always does, by becoming slightly different from what it was before. Nothing dramatic marks the transition. No announcement, no sudden redesign. Instead, details evolve. Bedding thickens by a layer. Sleeping positions draw a little closer together. The entrance is sealed more carefully each evening, packed tighter against wandering drafts. The shelter grows more inward, as if pulling its boundaries closer to protect what remains inside. In many cold regions during the 19th century, underground shelters were altered repeatedly as winter progressed. Early designs suited mild cold. Deep winter demanded refinement. Extra soil was added to walls. Vent openings were narrowed. Temporary barriers were built and removed as conditions changed. You recognize that pattern now as you watch someone press fresh earth into a seam that had not needed attention weeks ago. The fire schedule changes too. Where once embers were allowed to die completely at night, now a low glow is preserved, more often guarded carefully against excess. Fuel use increases slightly but not recklessly. The shelter is adapting, not panicking. You notice how clothing choices evolve as well. Layers once reserved for sleeping are worn during quiet indoor work. Damp garments are dried closer to bodies rather than by fire trading speed for safety. Winter teaches patience repeatedly, and the shelter becomes a classroom without lectures. A subtle observation appears in several winter journals noting that people often reoriented sleeping areas mid-season, rotating positions to account for shifting cold spots and moisture patterns. You take part in that adjustment now, sliding your bedding a few inches away from a wall that has grown cooler. The change is small, but it matters. There has been thoughtful examination by architectural historians about whether underground shelters were static structures or ongoing processes. The evidence favours the latter. These spaces were never finished. They were maintained conversations with weather. Sitting here, you feel that truth in the constant small corrections being made. You help with one such correction, reinforcing a low-wall wall with bundled plant matter tucked beneath soil. The work is slow, careful. Your hands learn the resistance of cold earth, the point at which pressure helps, and the point at which it harms. This is not construction as you might imagine it. It is tending. Someone adjusts the entrance passage again, extending it slightly with stacked materials to trap cold air before it reaches the main space. The difference is immediate. Drafts soften. The interior steadies. You breathe easier without quite knowing why. A curious detail mentioned in a few regional accounts describes families marking the deepest part of winter not by calendar, but by when they stopped opening the entrance except when absolutely necessary. You realize that threshold is approaching. Already trips above ground are shorter, more purposeful. The shelter has become the center rather than a refuge. Sound changes too. The earth above feels heavier, packed with weeks of snow. Vibrations dull further. Even distant noises lose their edges. The shelter grows quieter, not because people speak less, but because the world outside presses down harder. You sit back and take inventory without intending to. Bedding, fire, air, walls. Everything is adjusted just enough, not perfect. Functional, that is the standard here. Some scholars have suggested that these incremental adaptations fostered a sense of control during otherwise overwhelming seasons. Others argue they simply reflected necessity rather than psychology. From where you sit, the distinction feels unimportant. Control or necessity, the result is the same. You feel steadier. The shelter no longer feels temporary. It feels settled into winter itself, shaped to match its demands rather than resist them. That alignment reduces strain in ways that are difficult to explain but easy to feel. You lie down again and notice how quickly your body responds. Less shifting, fewer adjustments. The space fits you more closely now because it has been reshaped with you in mind. As sleep approaches, you realize that adaptation is not a one-time decision. It is a rhythm. Each night teaches the shelter something. At morning, confirms whether the lesson was learned. The earth above remains cold and indifferent. Inside, small changes have accumulated into something resilient. The shelter has not defeated winter. It has learned how to live with it. And wrapped in that evolving balance, you drift toward rest again, trusting that when conditions shift once more, the shelter and the people within it will adjust quietly, patiently, and just in time. You realize that there are rules here, even though no one has ever spoken them aloud. They reveal themselves through repetition, through the way certain actions are accepted instantly while others draw quiet correction. Underground life runs on agreements that do not need names. You learn them by watching, by noticing when someone pauses before moving, by seeing which paths through the shelter are taken and which are avoided. There is a rhythm to shared space that only works if everyone respects it. One of the first rules is about passage. You do not step over the people unless there is no alternative. You do not cross the shelter without purpose. Movement is efficient and considerate because unnecessary motion disturbs warmth and attention. When someone needs to pass, they wait for a natural opening rather than forcing one. Another rule concerns tools. Anything sharp or heavy is returned to its place immediately after use. Not later, not eventually. Underground misplaced tools are hazards, not inconveniences. This habit appears repeatedly in winter household notes where order is treated as a form of safety rather than tidiness. You see this rule in action when someone finishes repairing a handle and sets the tool back into its slot without looking, muscle memory guiding the motion. No one comments. The action speaks for itself. Sleeping arrangements follow their own code. You do not claim the warmest spot permanently. Positions rotate. Needs are weighed quietly. Someone recovering from strain or sickness is placed closer to stable heat without discussion. This redistribution happens smoothly as if the shelter itself were making the decision. There is also a rule about sound. You do not raise your voice unless urgency demands it. Even laughter is shaped to fit the space softened at the edges. Underground acoustics punish carelessness quickly. Everyone learns that lesson early. A small but telling recollection from one winter letter describes how a visitor was gently corrected for humming too loudly, not because it was forbidden but because it disrupted everyone's ability to listen to the shelter itself. You understand that now. Sound here is information. Too much of it becomes noise. Privacy exists, but it is limited and negotiated. You avert your eyes when passing someone changing layers. You give space when someone needs a moment of stillness. These gestures are small, but they accumulate into trust. There has been thoughtful discussion among social historians about whether such unspoken rules strengthened group cohesion or suppressed individuality. Observing them in practice, you sense they do both. They restrict certain freedoms, but they protect others, more important ones. Warmth, rest, safety. Another rule governs the entrance. You do not open it casually. Every opening invites cold and moisture. When it must be opened, someone is always ready to close it again quickly. This coordination happens without words learned through repetition. You notice how newcomers learn these rules fastest. The space teaches them. A misplaced step earns a look. A louder movement earns a pause. Correction is subtle, rarely verbal. No one wants to spend energy on conflict when winter already demands so much. There is also a rule about food. You eat what is given without complaint. Preferences are luxuries not entertained here. Waste is treated almost as an insult not to the people present, but to the effort it took to gather and preserve resources. You finish what you take even if slowly. An unusual detail mentioned in a few personal journals describes how children sometimes became the strictest enforcers of these rules, correcting adults who forgot themselves. The space trained them early, and they guarded its balance fiercely. You smile faintly at the thought. It feels true. Rest follows its own pattern as well. You do not wake others unnecessarily. You do not linger near sleeping bodies without purpose. You move with the assumption that someone is always resting, even if you cannot see them clearly. Some scholars have suggested that these social patterns underground resemble those found in other confined environments such as ships or winter camps. Others argue the intimacy of shared earth made them distinct. From where you sit, the difference feels clear. The ground itself enforces the rules, making them harder to ignore. As evening returns, you feel these agreements settle into place again. Bodies arrange themselves predictably, tools disappear into storage, voices lower. The shelter shifts from workspace back into resting place with minimal friction. You take your position without hesitation, now knowing where you belong in the arrangement. That knowledge feels earned rather than assigned. You're not told where to lie, you sense it. The rules do not feel oppressive. They feel clarifying. They remove uncertainty. They tell you how to exist here without constant negotiation. As you close your eyes, you realize that these unspoken agreements are as much a part of the shelter as the walls themselves. They hold the group together, distributing effort and care evenly enough that no one carries the full weight alone. Underground survival is not enforced through command, it is maintained through understanding. And wrapped in that shared understanding, sleep arrives again steady and uninterrupted, ready to carry you through another winter night beneath the earth. Sleep feels heavier tonight, denser, as if darkness itself has weight. You sink into it rather than drifting across the surface. The absence of light presses gently against your closed eyes, encouraging rest that is deeper and slower than anything you remember above ground. Dreams arrive differently underground. They do not scatter, they gather. You notice this when you surface briefly from sleep, hovering just long enough to register where you are. The shelter is sen. Breathing nearby is steady. No firelight flickers. Darkness is complete, not empty but full, like soil packed tight around thought. Then you slip back under and the dreams return immediately, thick and immersive. People who slept below ground during harsh winters sometimes remarked almost offhandedly that their dreams felt longer and more vivid. The comment usually appeared as a curiosity rather than a concern, as if it surprised them, but did not trouble them. Lying here now, you understand why. With fewer interruptions, the mind travels farther before waking. Your dreams move slowly. Scenes linger. Sounds are muted, familiar. You are not jolted awake by sudden brightness or noise. The underground quiet allows imagination to unfold without urgency. Even moments of tension soften before they sharpen. You dream of walking across snow but without cold, of being outside while still protected. The earth seems to follow you, even there, reshaping memory and expectation. You wake briefly, then return to sleep without resistance. There is long-standing discussion among sleep researchers and historians about whether environments with minimal sensory change encourage deeper rest, or simply longer cycles of dreaming. Some argue that monotony allows the brain to stay in certain stages longer. Others suggest it depends more on exhaustion than surroundings. From where you lie, the distinction blurs, the environment and fatigue of work together. You roll slightly, adjusting your position without fully waking. The movement carries into your dreams, shifting scenes gently rather than breaking them. A sound becomes a landscape, a breath becomes wind. The shelter does not intrude, it integrates. A small but intriguing note appears in a winter journal describing how someone dreamed repeatedly of enclosed spaces after weeks in underground caves and tunnels, appearing not as traps, but as places of refuge. You recognize that pattern now. Your dreams do not fear enclosure, they welcome it. When you surface again, you do so calmly. There is no rush, no confusion. Darkness remains unchanged, reassuring in its consistency. You know exactly where you are without opening your eyes. Your body has mapped the space so thoroughly that orientation no longer requires sight. You listen for sound and find none that demand attention. No dripping, no shifting earth, no coughs. The shelter rests fully, and in that rest it invites deeper sleep rather than lighter vigilance. Some scholars have wondered whether the lack of night and day cues disrupted circadian rhythms for those living underground. Others argue that strong routines replace solar signals effectively. Your body seems unconcerned with the debate. It sleeps when it can, deeply and thoroughly, taking advantage of the stability offered. Dreams resume. This time they are quieter. Less narrative, more sensation, warmth, pressure, stillness. You feel yourself breathing in the dream the same way you breathe here, slow and measured. The boundary between sleeping and waking narrows without becoming uncomfortable. A memory surfaces of light through a window, but it fades quickly, replaced by a darker, softer image that feels safer. Your mind has learned which signals matter now. Brightness has lost its urgency. You turn again, feeling bedding shift beneath you. The ground responds by holding steady. No sudden cold rises, no dampness. Intro. That reliability allows your mind to stay submerged longer. There has been academic disagreement about whether deep, uninterrupted sleep was common in underground winter shelters, or whether people slept in fragments due to shared space and environmental demands. Accounts suggest both occurred. From your experience tonight, fragmentation has softened. Familiarity has smoothed the edges. Another brief waking moment passes. You swallow, adjust your jaw, then sink back again. Each return to sleep feels easier than the last, like descending familiar steps. You dream of voices, but not words. Of stories told earlier, now reduced to rhythm. A warmth passed hand to hand. These dreams do not demand interpretation. They simply occur. A faint thought crosses your mind about morning, about work waiting above ground, but it dissolves before forming fully. The shelter does not encourage anticipation. It encourages presence. You drift deeper still, losing track of how many times you have surfaced and returned. Time has become elastic, stretching and compressing without reference. Hours may have passed, or only minutes. It no longer matters. In one winter account, a settler wrote that underground sleep felt like being folded into the night rather than lying beneath it. You understand that phrase now. Darkness is not something you endure here. It is something you inhabit. Your breathing remains steady. Muscles release further. Even your hands, often curled slightly in readiness, relax completely. The earth above does not demand alertness tonight. It offers steadiness instead. Dreams slow again, thinning into near stillness. You float between states without concern. This liminal space feels safe, protected by soil and shared presence. When you wake again, it is with a sense of fullness rather than interruption. Sleep has done its work thoroughly. You have not escaped winter, but you have rested within it. The shelter remains unchanged. Darkness still holds. Bodies nearby remain asleep. There is no signal to rise yet. You close your eyes again, not because you must, but because you can. Underground deep sleep is not a luxury. It is a strategy, one that preserves strength, steadies emotion, and prepares you for the demands waiting above the frost line. Wrapped in earth and quiet, you return to rest once more, carrying with you the slow dream, heavy calm that only complete darkness and practiced shelter can provide. You hear about the others mostly in fragments, never as full stories. A comment murmured while boots are pulled on. A comparison offered without judgment. Someone slept above ground last night. Someone else tried it once and did not repeat the experiment. You picture them now, neighbours in cabins or sod houses, listening to walls creak and wind probe every seam. Their nights sound louder, somehow more demanding. Here the earth has taken on that burden for you. In many winter settlements of the 19th century, people lived side by side using very different strategies to endure the same cold. Some trusted timber and height, others trusted depth and weight. These choices were shaped by land resources and temperament as much as by tradition. You feel that contrast clearly when stories drift down to you from above ground life. Someone mentions waking to frost on the inside of a window, breath forming crystals on glass. Another recalls the sound of boards snapping as temperatures dropped overnight. The descriptions are offered plainly, not as complaints. They are facts, part of someone else's routine. You imagine lying in a raised bed while wind searches for gaps, each gust a reminder that you're exposed. Even thick walls cannot stop sound the way soil can. Even good stoves demand constant attention. Above ground sleep requires vigilance of a different kind. A brief note appears in a traveller's account describing how he preferred underground lodging during storms, because it felt quieter even if it was darker and closer. You nod internally. Quiet has become valuable to you not as an absence but as protection. You listen as someone else describes an above-ground night spent feeding a fire every few hours to keep pipes from freezing or walls from icing over. Here the fire has been allowed to rest. The shelter has carried the night on its own. There has been thoughtful disagreement among historians about whether underground living offered better overall winter survival than surface dwellings. Some point to health risks and flooding. Others emphasize fuel savings and stability. From where you lie, the comparison feels less about superiority and more about fit. Different bodies choose different solutions. You think about light. Above ground morning announces itself whether you are ready or not. Here light waits for permission. That difference reshapes rest. You wake when your body has finished sleeping, not when the sky decides it is time. A small but telling anecdote from a settler journal mentioned someone feeling startled by sunrise after weeks underground, the brightness arriving too suddenly, too insistently. You smile faintly at that image. Darkness has taught your eyes patience. You shift slightly and feel the wall against your back, solid, quiet, predictable. Above-ground walls answer to wind, and you hear walls answer only to gravity. Someone nearby remarks that the underground shelter feels warmer even when it is technically colder than a cabin. The observation is not scientific but experiential. Wind stills heat faster than still air ever could. Soil blocks that theft completely. Some researchers have suggested that underground dwellers developed a different relationship with weather, paying less attention to forecasts and more to ground conditions. You understand that shift now. Snowfall matters only in how it weighs on the roof. Temperature matters only in how it changes moisture. The sky itself has lost authority. You imagine walking from this shelter into a nearby cabin, feeling the openness overhead, the height, the echo of footsteps. It would feel exposed now, even luxurious perhaps, but oddly vulnerable. The comparison sharpens your appreciation for what surrounds you. Underground life has taught you to value compression, containment and predictability. Comfort has become something quieter than softness. As night deepens, again you stop thinking about how others sleep. Comparison fades. What matters is that you are warm enough, dry enough, and rested enough. The shelter has met its obligations. You let the thoughts drift away and settle back into the familiar rhythm of breath and stillness. Above ground, wind may be working hard. Here the earth continues to do its job without comment, and as sleep takes you again, you understand that winter survival has never had a single correct answer. It has only had choices that fit particular people and particular places. Tonight underground fits you. Waiting becomes the dominant activity now, though no one calls it that. The shelter has reached a point where change happens slowly, almost reluctantly. Winter has spent much of its force, but it has not yet loosened its grip. You feel that tension in the way people pause more often listening, not for storms, but for signs of easing. The ground tells its own story. It feels different beneath your hands, less rigid than it was weeks ago. Not soft exactly, but willing. The soil no longer resists every touch with the same stubborn cold. That shift is subtle but unmistakable once you have lived close to it long enough. In many 19th century settlements, people marked the approaching thaw by changes underground rather than by dates on a calendar. Drips appeared where none had before. Earth smelled different, richer, less sharp. You notice those signals now. Moisture behaves differently. It lingers a little longer before freezing. The shelter responds with quiet adjustments. You lie awake for a moment listening to nothing in particular. The silence has changed a texture. It feels less dense, less absolute. Somewhere above snow is beginning to settle differently, compacting rather than piling. The weight overhead remains, but it is no longer increasing. You think about how much of winter underground is spent enduring and how much is spent anticipating its end. Anticipation creeps in carefully because disappointment is costly. People here have learned not to rush hope. Someone stirs near the entrance, adjusting a barrier that has been in place for weeks. It is loosened just slightly, not removed. Cold still exists. Thaw is not a promise, only a possibility. The shelter does not overreact. A practical observation from period writings notes that people often delayed major changes to underground shelters until repeated signs confirmed the season was turning. One warm day meant nothing. Several did. You sense that caution now in the way no one celebrates early. You sit up and stretch slowly, feeling how your body responds. Stiffness eases faster than it once did. Circulation returns with less effort. These changes are small, but they accumulate into something noticeable. Your body, like the shelter, is preparing for a shift. There's been discussion among historians about whether the psychological toll of waiting through late winter was heavier than the cold itself. Some argue that endurance peaked early and frayed later. Others suggest routine carried people through until change arrived naturally. Sitting here, you feel neither frayed nor eager. You feel patient, The shelter feels patient too. Its walls remain firm, its ceiling holds, but there is less urgency in how it is tended. Checks still happen, but with a lighter touch. Problems feel less immediate, more manageable. A curious detail mentioned in a few regional diaries describes how people began spending slightly more time near the entrance during this period, as if orienting themselves towards the outside world again. You notice yourself doing the same lingering near the opening longer than you once did, breathing in air that carries a hint of change. The smell has shifted. Earth smells less metallic now, more alive. Smoke clings less stubbornly. Even darkness feels different, thinner somehow. These are impressions rather than facts, but they matter. You think about how much waiting underground teaches restraint. You cannot force the season to change. You cannot dig your way into spring. You wait and you will watch and you prepare quietly. Some researchers have suggested that this extended period of anticipation sharpened observation skills, turning people into careful readers of subtle environmental cues. Others believe it simply prolonged uncertainty. From where you sit, observation feels like agency. You cannot control the thaw, but you can notice it arriving. A faint sound reaches you from above, not wind, not snow, but water, moving somewhere beyond the shelter. It is distant and brief, but it holds your attention. That sound would have meant danger weeks ago. Now it suggests transition. You lie back down, letting that thought settle without expanding it. Hope underground is practiced gently. Too much of it would disrupt the balance that has carried you this far. The fire burns a little more freely now, allowed a touch more fuel without fear of waste. Air circulation increases slightly. Bedding is aired more often. These are not declarations, they are responses. You notice how conversations shift too. They stretch a little longer. Plans are mentioned without being fixed. Above ground, tasks are discussed in tentative terms. Nothing is scheduled firmly yet. The shelter remains the centre of life. There has been scholarly interest in how underground living influenced perceptions of time, particularly during this late winter phase. Some argue that waiting stretched time unbearably. Others suggest it compressed it as routines filled days efficiently. Your experience feels like a slow narrowing. Days matter less individually. What matters is readiness. You test that readiness unconsciously. You imagine stepping outside more often. You imagine the entrance opening wider. You imagine light lasting longer once it arrives. None of these images feel urgent, they feel possible. As night returns again, you sleep lightly but comfortably. Dreams shift toward movement and space, though enclosure remains present. You wake once, listen, and hear nothing alarming. The shelter holds. Waiting continues, but it no longer feels like endurance alone. It feels like transition in progress, slow and cautious. The ground beneath you has begun to change its mind, and you are patient enough to let it finish the thought. The return to the surface does not happen all at once. There is no single morning when the shelter opens and winter disappears. Instead, the change arrives in fragments, like the way sleep loosens its grip before you fully wake. You notice it first in behaviour rather than weather. Someone leaves the entrance open a few seconds longer than usual. Another person steps outside twice in one day without hesitation. The shelter remains important, but it is no longer the unquestioned centre of every decision. Light begins to matter again, not because it reaches you underground, but because people talk about it. Someone mentions how long it stayed this afternoon. Someone else remarks on shadows shifting. These comments feel tentative, as if speaking them aloud might invite disappointment. In many 19th century communities that relied on underground shelters, the move back towards surface living was described as gradual rather than celebratory. Diaries often record practical notes instead of emotions. The ground dried here. The roof was checked there. You recognise that tone now. Caution leads enthusiasm. You climb partway up the entrance passage and pause, letting cooler air wash over you. It feels different than before. Less biting, more damp than sharp. Snow still lies thick, but it has lost some of its authority. It compresses underfoot instead of resisting. You stand outside briefly, eyes adjusting to light that feels almost too open after weeks of darkness. The sky looks larger than you remember. Sound travels farther. Wind feels louder, less filtered. You realize how much the shelter has changed your senses. A small but striking detail appears in several personal accounts describing how people felt oddly exposed after emerging from underground spaces even when conditions were mild. The openness took time to relearn. You feel that now. Your shoulders tense instinctively, searching for walls that are no longer there. You do not stay outside long, not yet. The shelter still feels like the correct place to rest. But the balance has shifted. It is no longer the only place that feels viable. There has been thoughtful discussion among historians about whether people experienced relief or unease when returning to above ground living after long winters underground. Some sources suggest joy, others suggest disorientation. Standing here, you feel a mix of both. Freedom tempered by vulnerability. You descend again, returning to familiar dimness. The transition feels smoother than you expected. The shelter has not been abandoned. It is simply being asked to share its role. Inside routines loosen. Bedding is spread wider during the day. Ventilation remains open longer. Fire is allowed to burn brighter in the evenings. Not out of necessity, but habit easing its grip. The shelter feels less tightly coiled. A curious note in one winter journal mentions that people often delayed dismantling or neglecting underground shelters even after surface living resumed keeping them ready in case weather turned again. You understand that instinct immediately. Trust is not withdrawn quickly. You take time to clean and sort. Tools are organized more thoroughly. Bedding is dried longer. These acts feel like gratitude rather than maintenance. The shelter has carried you through something difficult. You tend it carefully in return. As days pass, trips outside grow longer. Work shifts upward. The shelter empties more often during daylight hours, then fills again at night. Those sleeping arrangements grow looser. People spread out. Bodies no longer cluster as tightly. Some researchers have suggested that underground shelters lingered psychologically long after they were physically left, shaping how people perceived safety and enclosure in later years. You sense that lingering now. Even outside part of you listens for muffled sound that is no longer there. You notice how quickly your eyes adapt back to light, yet how slow your mind is to accept it. Brightness feels demanding. Darkness had been patient. You take breaks stepping back inside when the openness becomes tiring. Conversations turn toward plans, repairs to cabins, storage for winter gear, crops to prepare. These discussions are cautious but forward-looking. The future has returned as a topic. You sit near the entrance one evening, half in light, half in shadow. The shelter feels different from this position. Less like a refuge, more like a foundation. It has done its work. It does not insist on being central anymore. There is an understated moment in several historical letters where people describe the final night spent sleeping underground as strangely unremarkable. No ceremony, no final glance, just another night that happens to be the last. You sense that approaching now. You lie down one evening and realize you're less aware of the walls. Sleep comes easily but lighter. Your body knows it will soon have options. That knowledge changes rest without disrupting it. The next morning, fewer people descend back underground. Tasks keep them above longer. Meals are eaten in brighter spaces. The shelter waits quiet and unchanged, but less occupied. You return once more, standing in the center of the space and letting your eyes adjust. It looks smaller than it once did, not because it has shrunk, but because your sense of scale has expanded again. The shelter has not changed. You have. There is no moment when you decide to leave it behind completely. It happens naturally. One day you realize you did not sleep there the night before. Another day you realize you did not miss it. And yet as you stand at the entrance and look back into the dimness, you feel a steady appreciation. The shelter was never meant to be permanent. It was meant to be enough. It was enough to hold warmth, enough to hold people, enough to hold fear at a manageable distance. As you turn toward the surface again, you carry those lessons with you. Not as nostalgia, but as knowledge that will shape how you face future winters. The ground below remains quiet and ready should it ever be needed again. You do not think about the ground much anymore. That you realize is the final lesson it offers you. When something has done its job well, it fades quietly from attention. You sleep above ground now or closer to it, and the world feels louder again. Wind speaks freely. Light arrives without asking. Space stretches outward in ways that once felt uncomfortable but now feel merely different. Still, something in you has changed. You no longer assume that safety comes from openness. You know it can come from closeness too. Looking back, you understand that sleeping underground was never about hiding. It was about choosing a relationship with the earth that prioritized steadiness over spectacle. People in the 19th century did not romanticize this choice. They made it because it worked. Earth held heat. Earth blocked wind. Earth softened the violence of winter into something survivable. That reality shows up repeatedly in practical records of the time written without flourish. Dugouts stayed warmer. Fuel lasted longer. Nights passed with fewer emergencies. These were not poetic observations. They were outcomes. And yet there are moments that linger beyond practicality. You remember how sound changed underground, how silence felt full instead of empty. You remember how darkness stopped being something to fight. You remember how bodies arranged themselves instinctively, redistributing warmth and care without instruction. There has long been reflection among historians about whether underground living shaped personality as much as it shaped behavior. Some suggest it encouraged inwardness. Others believe it strengthened communal instincts. You carry pieces of both now. You listen more closely. You waste less energy. You trust small, reliable systems over dramatic solutions. A detail that stays with you is how little ceremony accompanied both the beginning and the end of underground life. No grand entrance, no formal goodbye. People stepped in when winter demanded it, and stepped out when conditions allowed. The ground was a tool, not a symbol. You think about how modern life often searches for comfort in excess. More heat, more speak, more noise. Underground winters taught the opposite lesson. Enough is often better than more. Predictability can be more restful than abundance. You lie down now wherever you are and notice how your body still remembers. You curl slightly without needing to. You appreciate still air. You fall asleep more easily in darkness than you once did. The ground has left its imprint. Some scholars have suggested that these kinds of seasonal adaptations faded quickly once technology offered alternatives. Others argue the instincts never fully disappeared. They simply went quiet. You suspect the latter. The knowledge is still there waiting. As sleep approaches, you no longer imagine the earth above you, but you do remember what it felt like to be held by it, to trust it, to rest without watching the sky. That memory settles you. Now the pace slows even further. Breathing lengthens. Thoughts soften at the edges and begin to drift rather than move forward. You no longer need to picture snow or soil or shelter. Those images have done their work. You're warm enough, supported enough, safe enough. The ground does not need to be beneath you for its lesson to remain. You've learned how to make your world smaller when it needs to be. How to listen for what matters. How to let the rest fade. Imagine the earth resting now too, quiet, patient, unconcerned with whether it is noticed. Winter passes, seasons turn, the ground remains. You allow your body to grow heavier. Muscles release, jaw loosens, hands unclench. There is nothing left to solve tonight. Just rest, just breath, just the gentle certainty that humans have always found ways to sleep, even in the hardest seasons, by paying attention, cooperating and trusting simple things to do what they do best. Stay here as long as you like. Sweet dreams and sweet dreams.